And welcome to the 33rd meeting of the Education, Children and Young People Committee in 2024. The first and only item on our agenda today is consideration of the Scottish Languages Bill at Stage 2, Day 1. I'd like to welcome Kate Forbes, Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Economy and Gaelic to the meeting, along with her supporting officials. The officials seated at the table are here to support the Deputy First Minister but are not able to speak in the debates on the amendments. Therefore, members should direct their comments or questions for the Scottish Government to the Deputy First Minister. Before we begin, I'll briefly explain the procedure we'll be following this morning for anyone who is watching. The amendments that have been lodged on the bill have been grouped together. There will be one debate on each group of amendments. I'll call the member who lodged the first amendment in the group to speak to and move that amendment and to speak to all other amendments in the group. I'll then call any other members who have lodged amendments in that group, and members who have not lodged amendments in the group but who wish to speak should indicate to me. If she's not already spoken at that point on the group, I'll then invite the Deputy First Minister to contribute to the debate. The debate on the group will be concluded by me inviting the member who moved the first amendment in the group to wind up. Following the debate on each group, I'll check whether the member who moved the first amendment in the group wishes to press the amendment to a vote or to withdraw it, and if they wish to press ahead, I'll put the question on that amendment. If a member wishes to withdraw their amendment after it's been moved, they must seek the agreement of other members to do so. If any member present objects, the committee will immediately move to vote on the amendment. If any member does not want to move their amendment when called, they should say not moved. And please note that any other member present may move such an amendment. If no one moves the amendment, I will immediately call the next amendment on the marshalled list. Only committee members are allowed to vote. Voting in any division is by a show of hands, and it's important that members keep their hands raised until the clerks have recorded the vote. The committee is also required to indicate formally that it has considered and agreed each section of the bill, so I will put the question on each section at the appropriate point. And with those hopefully helpful instructions, we've now covered the housekeeping matters and we can move to the substantive business for today. So I call Amendment 76 in the name of Ross Greer, group with Amendments 16, 35, 50 and 96. Ross Greer to move Amendment 76 and speak to all amendments in the group. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning all. Moving Amendment 76. 76 and 96 are about the definition of official status in the bill. That's a significant part of this bill, one of the key motivators behind it. But the question that the Law Society posed is, what does that actually mean? At the moment, we don't have a definition of official status. So 76 and 96 are the Law Society's proposals for how we define it, and it's simply to define official status in the case of 76 for Gaelic and 96 for Scots. That official status means that they have equal respect, command equal respect to English. 16, 35 and 50 in this group further thread that principle of equal respect through the bill in relation to Gaelic, because there's already a subsection in the bill that uses this language of equal respect. So 22C in Part 1 of the bill sets out what I think is a really useful principle around equal respect that I think should be seen as the touchstone for Gaelic policy across the board. So in the section that is currently in the bill, that 22C, it's in relation to the responsibilities of Borna Gaelig in supporting other public authorities, and it says that they must seek to give effect, so far as is both appropriate in the circumstances and reasonably practical, to the principle that Gaelic and the Gaelic and English languages should be accorded equal respect. So I'm simply taking the language that's already in the bill in that particular section and putting it elsewhere. So in the case of 16, that is inserting that principle of equal respect in the section about preparation of the Gaelic language strategy. In 35, it is the production of guidance by ministers, and in 50, it is about the preparation of Gaelic language plans. So this section is simply, as a whole, about taking language that is already in the bill in one particular section and threading it elsewhere throughout, because I think that principle of equal respect should be underlining everything else we do in relation to this bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy First Minister.
Well, Martin Va, and thank you very much to Ross Greer for explaining the purposes of these amendments. The current drafting of the bill grants both Gaelic and Scots official status within Scotland, and our position is that that wording gives both languages the requisite standing within Scotland's public life. The inclusion of a clear statement of official status in the bill is an important part of recognising Gaelic and Scots, and the inclusion of that statement was welcomed by both Gaelic and Scots interests because it's a means of countering some of the neglect of earlier times and practices, neglect that we want to reverse in this bill. The approach that we've taken in drafting the bill is intended to signpost the high policy aspirations we hold for these languages. Definitions in this area are difficult, and there's no standard universal understanding of concepts such as official status or official language. Those concepts have different meanings in different countries, and that's why instead of including a definition which can't be consistently interpreted, we have carefully set out in subsection 2 of each provision how the statement that Gaelic and Scots have official status is given legal effect. So we would argue respectfully that Amendments 76 and 96 would result in a lack of clarity in the legal effect of the statements on official status for Gaelic and Scots, which could create considerable legal and budgetary uncertainty and risk for public authorities. I do, of course, believe in the principle of equal respect for Gaelic and Scots, but I believe that that can be better written into the bill through support for Amendments 16, 35 and 50, which require that the principle should be considered at precise points where that requires concrete and specific action by Scottish ministers and public authorities. So, as Ross Greer has said, Amendments 16 and 35 modify the bill to require ministers to have regard to the principle of equal respect when preparing the ministerial Gaelic language strategy and guidance, and Amendment 50 requires public bodies to have regard to the principle of equal respect when preparing their Gaelic language plans, so at precise points. We are therefore happy to support Amendments 16, 35 and 50 because they meaningfully strengthen the bill's provisions in relation to equal respect at particular points, and those amendments make clear the support for equal respect without creating the uncertainty which we believe would be the result of Amendments 76 and 96. So we would be disinclined to support those particular amendments, would urge Mr Greer not to press them whilst fully endorsing the principle of equal respect that his other amendments highlight. Thank you.
Okay, I'll only check on this one since it's our first one, but no other member has indicated they want to come in. Therefore, I ask Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 76.
Thank you, Convener. I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary's comments on this and understand the Government's position on it. I'd be happy at this point not to move 76 and 96, though I would welcome if the Cabinet Secretary was agreeable to further engagement ahead of stage 3, because I'm conscious in particular on Scots that principle of equal respect is not particularly present throughout the bill. So my amendments 16, 35 and 50 are primarily in relation to Gaelic, and if we are all agreed on the principle of equal respect, I think there's perhaps more work we can do ahead of stage 3 on making sure that that's represented for Scots as well. But with that, I'm happy not to move 76.
Okay, Ross Greer seeks to withdraw Amendment 76. Does any member object? No member has objected, so Amendment 76 is withdrawn. The question is that Section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 1 in the name of the Deputy First Minister and a group of its own. Deputy First Minister to move and speak to Amendment 1.
Thank you. I'll move at the outset and then speak to it. This amendment really comes off the back of feedback from the committee and feedback from a number of stakeholders about the importance of refocusing our efforts very much on communities. And it's important that Gaelic community development, planning and support is prioritised. The bill will strengthen the focus on support for Gaelic at a community level, at that grassroots level. And this amendment ensures that advice, assistance and support from Báirse na Gaelic is in place. The amendment will make support for community language planning a requirement of Bord na Gaelic's wider functions. And that renewed focus on community activity with support from the board will be important for Gaelic in the years ahead, securing a range of benefits, social, cultural, educational and economic. And I believe was probably the biggest ask from committee when going through the evidence session prior to stage 1. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything to say by way of wind-up? No. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 1 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. The question is that Section 2 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 2 in the name of Ross Greer, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Ross Greer to move Amendment 2 and speak to all amendments in the group. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I'm afraid this is the start of quite a long run of amendments from me, but not all of my speaking notes are too long. So in this section, so amendments 2, 9 through 12, 17, 19 through 25, 36, 42, 48 and 49 all simply insert the word national at various points in the bill. And the intention here is to make sure there's absolute clarity that when we're talking about the Gaelic language strategy, we are talking about the national strategy for which ministers have responsibility that is replacing the National Gaelic Language Plan that exists as a result of the 2005 Act. Obviously, there are lots of other documents that will be referred to as strategies, plans, etc., that will be produced as an effect of this bill. So this is simply so that there's absolute clarity that in all sections where we are talking about the Gaelic language strategy in what will hopefully be the Act, it's clear that we are talking about the National Gaelic Language Strategy for which ministers have responsibility. So that's the rationale behind all of those, which I hope is simple and agreeable to members. Yes, please.
I thank the member for taking the intervention on that point. Just for clarity then, the member thinks it's important that there are still local approaches to other strategies, that this is simply to clarify that there's a national one, but there should also be local ones as well, giving voice to local people, local communities and local organisations.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for Pam Duncan-Glancy's intervention on that point. I think that is incredibly important, that we will need locally appropriate plans and strategies across the country, because different communities have different needs in relation to Gaelic and Scots, and that those local strategies will require more flexibility. I think it's appropriate for us as Parliament to be a bit more prescriptive about what we want to see in the national strategy, whereas those local strategies, it's more appropriate to have that greater level of flexibility. So this is about clarifying here in the various sections where we are relatively prescriptive about what should be in that strategy, and perhaps more prescriptive after these stage 2 amendments, that what we are prescribing is for the national strategy, and that there's still the ability to be more flexible with local strategies, plans, however they're phrased. 18 simply adds that ministers must publicise consultation on the draft strategy, so it's up to government how they do that. But at the moment, there's not a provision to share the consultation publicly or widely. So this amendment simply clarifies that if the draft strategy is to be consulted on, that consultation has to be publicised at large. And 78, on the same principle, that there really needs to be that greater level of transparency and a more informed view of the basis on which the policy underpinning the strategy was formed. So the results of the consultation must be published. I've got further amendments later on this morning to that effect, that wherever a consultation takes place, that the results of that consultation should be published, simply so that we ensure there's maximum public confidence and buy-in into the process. So 18 is requiring that the consultation is publicised. 78 requires that the results of any consultation are published. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Deputy First Minister.
Well, thank you very much. The Bill's provisions for a Gaelic language strategy to be prepared by Scottish ministers brings new status and profile to language planning, and I understand that Mr Greer's intention to bringing these amendments is to emphasise that status. It's worth saying at this point that in my earlier evidence to committee, during stage 1 and then in all subsequent meetings, I've made clear, I think, to everyone here that I wanted to collaborate. And so although we don't think that some of these amendments are absolutely essential, I want this bill to be shaped by all parties in Parliament. And so if Mr Greer feels that this name for the strategy better emphasises the importance of Gaelic to our national life, then I am happy to support the amendments. The Gaelic Language Scotland Act added the word national to Bord Gaelic's Gaelic language plan to distinguish it from the individual Gaelic language plans that were produced by public authorities. The National Gaelic Language Plan between 2023 to 2028 will remain with us in the coming years, and the many initiatives and commitments it contains for Gaelic will be implemented. Having both a National Gaelic Language Plan and a National Gaelic Language Strategy may create the potential for confusion between the documents, which is partly why we didn't include national in the title at introduction. And of course, there are other strategies that are produced by Scottish ministers which lend it the status of a national strategy by default, like the circular economy strategy, fuel poverty strategy, the forestry strategy. They don't automatically include the word national in their titles, but one hopes and assumes that people know by their very nature they are national. But we are very happy to support the amendments in Ross Greer's name that does add the word national throughout the bill. Coming on to Amendment 18 and 78, finally. It was always our intention for the consultation on the draft Gaelic language strategy included in the bill to be a public consultation and to allow for all interested parties to make representations about it. I'm very happy to support Ross Greer's Amendment 18, which makes that clear, and I'm also very happy to commit to publishing the result of the consultation and therefore to support Mr Greer's Amendment 78 to set that out in the bill. So, if I have explained that correctly, that means that we are very happy to support all of Ross Greer's amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 2.
Thanks, Convener, and grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for remarks and the support for these amendments. I should have just mentioned at the start, so the amendments in relation to inserting the word national, to clarify, and Amendment 18 around publicising the consultation. I should give credit to Professor Wilson-MacLeod, who gave evidence to the committee at stage 1, and through my engagement with him, many of the proposals that I'm moving this morning came about, particularly these ones. And I should put on the record, of course, that Amendment 78 is a proposal from the Law Society as well.
And
apologies, I press Amendment 2.
The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 77 in the name of Ross Greer and a group of its own. Ross Greer to move and speak to Amendment 77.
Thanks, Convener. Hopefully a short one here. So, again, this is a proposal that originated from discussions between myself and the Law Society. So this would add a provision on ministers having to provide reason for the rejection of a corporate plan that's been produced by the board. This is simply about ensuring greater transparency. Obviously, my expectation is that it would be extremely rare for it ever to get to the point where any final corporate plan produced by the board is rejected by ministers, because my expectation would be that if there are any serious issues with it, there would be far greater engagement earlier in the process when it's in draft form, and that back and forward dialogue would resolve it. If it were ever to get to the place where the corporate plan produced by the board was judged by ministers to be so deficient that they rejected it, I think it is an important point of transparency and a matter of public confidence here that ministers should have to provide reasons for why they have rejected it, which is the rationale behind Amendment 77.
Thank you. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much again for, and I'm very grateful to Ross Greer for the extensive work he's done in submitting amendments. In terms of Amendment 77, Bord na Gaelic have submitted successive national Gaelic language plans to Scottish ministers under the Gaelic Language Scotland Act 2005 since it came into force, and those plans have been successfully developed and approved through current provision. However, the member will be aware that the bill provides that ministers will now have the role of issuing a number of documents which used to originate with Bord na Gaelic. So that includes the statutory guidance on Gaelic language plans, statutory guidance on Gaelic education and the new Gaelic language strategy. And that reinforces the importance which Scottish ministers place on those documents and the leadership role that should sit with Scottish ministers for the Gaelic language. Amendment 77 goes to something quite different though, which is the board's own internal corporate plan. And the question of approval of a corporate plan for any non-departmental public body is a normal part of the internal processes and discussions between central government and NDPBs. So it's not a matter which requires parliamentary input. We feel would add an additional stage which would sit quite strangely with the iterative process that exists currently between non-departmental public bodies and Scottish governments. So I'm not supportive of this amendment. I would request the member not to press the amendment because I think this has implications for how NDPBs do their iterative process of producing internal documents, which doesn't require parliamentary input currently.
Thank you. Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 77.
Thank you, Convener. And again, I appreciate not just Cabinet Secretary's remarks on this, but the constructive way that we've engaged on these amendments to this point. And she's right to point out that this is not in relation to the Gaelic language strategy, because responsibility is moving to ministers. This is about the corporate plan of an NDPB. And in that sense, the rationale for me behind this amendment doesn't really have anything to do with the Gaelic language. This is about my view, and certainly my party's view, around the transparency of public bodies in Scotland. And the Cabinet Secretary is quite right to point out the iterative process that currently exists for the production of corporate plans by NDPBs. And as I pointed out in my opening remarks, this provision would only come into place at the end of that process. The iterative process is about the production of the drafting of a corporate plan. If we are ever to get to the point where that iterative process has taken place as normal, and yet at the end of it, a corporate plan by any NDPB is produced that ministers believe is so deficient that they reject, I think it is an important matter of transparency and public confidence that ministers should have to give a rationale behind that. So I suppose I'm being somewhat of an opportunist with this bill, because this bill relates to this particular NDPB, but as a point of transparency around the public sector, I would like to press Amendment 77.
Okay, the question is Amendment 77 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The amendment is not agreed, so there will be a division. So can I first of all ask those in favour of Amendment 77? Okay. And those against Amendment 77? The result of the vote on Amendment 77 is 4, against 6. There were no abstentions. Amendment 77 is therefore not agreed to. The question is that Section 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 3 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, group with Amendments 4, 5, 6 and 7. Deputy First Minister to move Amendments 3 and speak to all amendments in the group. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much, and moved at the outset before I forget. So this Amendment 3, 6 and 7 are very much again in response to, I think, very legitimate concerns that the committee raised. And I think it was Ruth McGuire, one of your predecessor members, who very specifically asked me this question when giving evidence. The aim of areas of linguistic significance is to give improved recognition to Gaelic in certain areas and to give communities a greater say in the development of a Gaelic language policy which applies to them. Again, recognising the importance and the renewed focus on communities. Amendment 3 requires, for areas which have 20% of the population with Gaelic language skills, that where the authority decides not to propose to designate that area, the authority must make public the decision and its reasons for not proceeding. Amendments 6 and 7 increase the level of community input to the process, which was a very specific ask from the committee. That enables communities to commence the process of designation of areas of linguistic significance by making that demand known to Bord na Gaelic, who must then request a local authority to consider making a designation. And one of the criticisms that has been made is that often Gaelic language policy is very top-down. This is about ensuring that at grassroots level, at the community level, they are able to make their views known and to trigger or initiate a process which would then give that area the linguistic significance status. The amendments also give Bord na Gaelic a key role in the process and encourage Bord na Gaelic to be active at a community level and to act in line with community representation. And that is to essentially ensure that there is a third party, and Boris na Gaelic are well placed to do that, who can manage the whole process. On Amendments 4 and 5 in the name of Pam Duncan Glancy, which I am very supportive in principle, I would be interested in progressing work with her, perhaps in advance of stage 3. The provisions in the bill already allow consultation with community councils where those councils wish to engage. There's already a broad consultation provision for such other persons as the authority considers appropriate to consult with. Where there is an active and engaged community council, clearly they would want to respond to any consultation for their area. But it is possible, and I think we all know this from our own areas, that a community council might be inactive, it might fail to respond, and it could therefore become quite difficult for the local authority to be sure that they've complied with the duty created by Amendment 5 if a community council isn't currently operational. And there are some small technical issues with the drafting as well. So I do consider it important to give effect to the principle that I think Pam Duncan Glancy is seeking to implement in the bill. And I'd be very happy to support Pam Duncan Glancy's Amendment 4 and 5, but would ask the member to work with me for stage 3 to ensure that the drafting of the provisions reflects those challenges and perhaps reflects more generally the diverse situation in various different communities where perhaps there aren't operational community councils. I would, yes.
Ross Greer.
I'm grateful to that, and it always feels awkward coming in before the member who's actually proposed the amendments. But I just wanted to clarify, the Deputy First Minister saying that she agrees with the principle of it. So why I particularly welcome these amendments is my concern that there may be a situation where a local authority has done all the community engagement right, they've got buy-in, but then government decides to modify the scheme, and that therefore risks the community buy-in that's already taken place. So just to clarify, does the government agree in principle that in any situation where the scheme is modified by government, that there should be direct community engagement before that decision takes place?
Deputy First Minister.
Absolutely. So I think your phrase, community buy-in, is critical. So my aim in working with the member would be to ensure that we give effect to the principle of community buy-in without tying our hands around community councils. So I know that in some communities, for example, there are really strong community trusts, there are really strong other community representatives that may actually be more reflective if a community council is inactive at the time. So yes, I too am extremely sympathetic and supportive of the principle. If we can just deal with some of the drafting issues, then I think we could come back at stage 3 with a really strong amendment in the name of Pam Duncan Glancy, if that is of interest, with hopefully the support of Ross Greer.
Thank you. I call Pam Duncan Glancy to speak to Amendment 4 and other amendments in the group. Pam Duncan Glancy.
Thank you, Convener, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary, Deputy First Minister, for her response and for her indication of support. So, just for completeness, I intend to support the Cabinet Secretary's amendments in this section as well. The reason that I brought these amendments was to do precisely what I've heard from the Deputy First Minister and from my colleague Ross Greer, which is to give communities a voice in the decision about whether or not an area should be designated as an area of linguistic significance. And we heard through evidence to the committee that there were some concerns that may not always easily be the case. And I think that added to the amendments that the Cabinet Secretary, Deputy First Minister has, I think this will give strength to community voice. The reason that we've chosen community councils in this particular amendment is because of the role that they play in supporting their local community and advocating for local communities. I take the point that if there wasn't a community council at that particular time active, that it could be quite difficult, and I wouldn't want to hold up a process of community engagement on that basis. So on the basis of what I've heard this morning, I'd be happy to work with the government ahead of stage 3 to bring something that I think we could all support and give voice to communities in these decisions. So thank you.
Thank you. Deputy First Minister to wind up.
No need to wind up beyond. I think we've got an agreed way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
That is agreed. I call Amendment 4 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated, with Amendment 3. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move or not move? Not moved. I call Amendment 5 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated, with Amendment 3. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call Amendment 6 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated, with Amendment 3. Deputy First Minister to move formally?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Amendment 6 is agreed to. I call Amendment 7 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated, with Amendment 3. Deputy First Minister to move formally?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I call Amendment 8 in the name of Michael Mara, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Michael Mara to move Amendment 8 and speak to all amendments in the group. Michael Mara.
Thank you, Convener, and move the amendments. So Scottish Labour does have concerns about the scope of the bill, and we set those out at stage 1. The key questions for the survival of the Gaelic language relate to a functioning economy and communities in the areas where Gaelic is already spoken. We know that the decline in number of Gaelic speakers in these areas is precipitous. Experts have given grave warnings to this committee about the future of the language without significant intervention. Good jobs, affordable housing, reliable transport links. These are all essential if we're to have a thriving economy in Gaelic-speaking areas. I do believe this bill is a missed opportunity for the kind of transformational change that Gaelic-speaking communities need, and some of my later amendments will give more detail on what that transformational change would be. Turning to the detail of the amendment, I do very much welcome the collegiate approach the Deputy First Minister has taken thus far around the bill, and I do believe there is cross-party consensus about the importance of the Gaelic language and the need to preserve it for future generations, which is very welcome. However, I'm concerned that without measurable targets and outcomes, the legislation risks becoming symbolic. We cannot afford for this to be a cosy consensus in Holyrood that in reality does little to reverse the current trend of decline in the number of Gaelic speakers in traditional Gaelic-speaking areas. There's little point in government or Parliament boasting about processes or inputs. It's the outcomes that matter to the people across the country. So my amendments in this area would insert a duty on Scottish ministers to specify targets, in essence to define a core intent around this bill and the strategy for dealing with the precipitous collapse in the number of Gaelic speakers in Scotland. So not really about just respect, as we've heard already, but about survival and the opportunity to thrive. So these targets that we've set out include the number of Gaelic speakers broken down by geographical area, the number of candidates entered for GME national qualifications, and the number of candidates entered for national qualifications in Gaelic. So I am under no illusion whatsoever that these are silver bullets or a solution, but I do believe they will strengthen the legislation so that Parliament and the public can get a sense of what this legislation is achieving, and so that the government can be held to account on whether it is actually allowing the Gaelic language to survive and thrive in Scotland.
Speak to Amendment 14 and other amendments in the group. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Convener. I think Michael Mara and I are coming at this particular section very much from the same place, and it is about the concern for the reality that Gaelic is on the edge right now as a living language. So my Amendment 14 recognising the fact that in the bill, ministers need to set out arrangements for monitoring progress towards objectives. So my amendment adds that they need to define how that progress will be measured. That reflects evidence that we took at stage 1 and the committee's stage 1 report, recognising that there is broad agreement about what we're trying to achieve, and it probably will not be difficult to get agreement around high-level objectives for the strategy. But those high-level objectives have some gulf between them and the reality that we are in at present. And what we need is to be very clear about not just what we're trying to do, but whether or not it's working. So we need to set out a very clear action plan, but we also need to know on a regular basis whether we are actually making progress towards that. So the question is, well, what are we measuring? What specifically in measurable terms are we trying to achieve? So reflecting the evidence that we took at stage 1, I've lodged Amendment 14, but as I say, it comes from a very similar place to all the amendments in Michael Mara's name.
First Minister.
Thank you very much. And again, my gratitude for these amendments, which I think, again, really enrich the debate that we are having around all of this. Suppose if I go back to perhaps the origin of some of these comments, which are the census figures, the fact that we saw a reduction in some areas but an overall growth indicates we need to get behind the figures to understand actually what is really going on at a local geographical level, as well as in terms of depth of language. And that does require a regular sort of progress update. To the amendments specifically, I do agree that having things to aim for is important, and those aims should be disruptive, they should be ambitious, they should be aspirational. And we have always been of the view that we should develop targets after consultation on the kind of things that we should have targets for and what those targets should be. Our view was that it should be in the Gaelic language strategy, and there's already a number of authorities and bodies that have targets for measuring their own activity, and that will be maintained. Just on the amendment that looks to do this every 2 years, obviously the National Census contains information on Gaelic speakers broken down by area and region. I think producing those same figures, so sort of at the same level as the census, every 2 years would be hugely challenging to do, so may not suit the time frame for reporting for the Gaelic strategy that's proposed in the bill. On Amendment 8, 13 and 15, which I'll speak to specifically, because actually Amendments 37, 41 and 43 are consequential on Amendments 8, 13 and 15, with the duty to create specific targets. There are a couple of things which I would make me want to resist the amendments at this stage, again with a view to doing something at stage 3. Whilst there's merit in setting targets, our preference, as I said, would be for those to be contained in the strategy rather than as a matter of regulation. As something very basic, the regulation-making power is not currently subject to any parliamentary procedure, for example. So the policy preference is for targets to be in the strategy instead, and we would want to look at the nature of those targets, whether these are the right targets. Overall, targets for people with Gaelic language skills probably wouldn't help us get behind the high-level figures that were already in the census in terms of the nature of those skills, the fluency levels of those skills, and basically, in summary, I would like to have targets. Yes, Michael Mara.
Deputy First Minister Given Way, would she agree that the census, in terms of the every decade, is insufficient to our needs, particularly given the rapidity of the decline in the numbers? That in essence we could wait until the next census and find that Gaelic had effectively died in Scotland. So that actually a big part of these amendments is to say that we can't wait for that analysis, that we need to do things that are more regular and to have a current understanding of the situation, because the situation is so dire that we have to address it. So there is a clear issue about time frame and the urgency to do something about it. And we should recognise that in our comments.
I do recognise that, and that's why there are amendments that we have lodged ourselves, which are to measure progress. So I think on these amendments, we are arguing that the opportunity to set targets is better done in the strategy, which can be updated faster, at pace. It doesn't need to wait for parliamentary cycles. That strategy will be consulted on. We will consult with stakeholders within Parliament, out with Parliament, make sure that the targets are right. When I look at the 3 targets here, and I suppose in my comments I'm trying to be very supportive to the notion that Michael Mara has put down, because I think he is right. I just would not support the way that we're currently trying to do this. If I look at target A, for example, Gaelic speakers broken down by geographical area, at the moment we would use a term people with Gaelic language skills rather than Gaelic speakers. But I think the bigger question is, having seen an increase in people with Gaelic language skills in the census, that may not tell us the whole story. We may actually want to know whether or not they have gone through Duolingo or actually are using the language in their daily lives. So my point is that I'm not sure that these are the right targets to be measuring on, and I don't think that they should be on the face of the bill because I think that actually what we need to see is a far more flexible response to the challenges that we face.
The Deputy First Minister taking intervention on that point. Thank you, Convener. Can I just ask for clarity?
Yeah.
Would you consider defining targets differently on the face of the bill, or do you not think there should be targets at all on the face of the bill?
Deputy First Minister.
I think that we should have a commitment to set targets, but that the nature of those targets should be clarified and defined in the subsequent strategy. So I think that we could support the principle of targets, the principle of aims and ambitions, and I think there could be a role for Parliament to scrutinise whether or not we are meeting those targets. But to put the three targets which are there, A, B and C, in terms of Gaelic speakers, doesn't get us, you know, if you were to look at that target in isolation, you would say we've met that target this year because of the census figures has shown a marginal increase. But it doesn't get behind the surface. Are you coming in again?
Thank you. And I appreciate that. I guess the difference is, and I understand that the targets being of a specific number could be left to strategy. But does the Deputy First Minister not recognise that it could be important to set out in legislation what the ambition is, and the kind of common practice way to do that is through defining what that could be in terms of what a target is? I take the point around some of the specific language, but should there not be something on the face of the bill around targets, and then the level of those targets set in a strategy?
Deputy First Minister.
So my view would be that the principle of the importance of containing targets in the strategy can be on the face of the bill. But if you become overly rigid in determining what those targets should be in 2024, and they will only inevitably be high-level targets, means that we are at risk of distorting Gaelic policy, Gaelic language policy, which should be better set out in the strategy and be far more responsive. Yeah, Miles.
I don't think we're all that far away from what we're trying to achieve. I hope to bring forward some amendments, but had a lodging issue in relation to this. But I think there's, like the Deputy First Minister says, setting a target is one thing, but actually measuring an outcome is very different, and trying to then look towards amendments maybe at stage 3, where I think all the members are pretty much in the same space on this. Would she be open to working with members to achieve that?
Deputy First Minister.
I would very much, and perhaps my slightly less sort of fluent answers are because I really care that members are keen to push government further on achieving their aims on Gaelic. But I do think that those three targets are actually not very reflective of where the conversation is just now across Gaelic language policy. So at the moment, the big debate is that although we've seen an increase overall in Gaelic speakers, we're seeing a decline in the traditional areas. And the targets don't actually go to the heart of that, nor do they go to the heart of the breadth of where a Gaelic speaker can use their language. So you may have somebody that speaks the language or has some sort of skills in the language which would meet target A, but actually they can't use the language anywhere. So I think we know that across policy development in any sphere of government or public sector work, the moment you set down targets in primary legislation, all activity becomes consumed with achieving those targets. If they are the wrong targets, then the next 10 years will be engaged in meeting the wrong targets. And I reckon that we'll be back here in a few years' time saying, well, as the 2024 census results revealed, the figures are going up. Government can therefore celebrate theoretically because they've met the legislative requirements on them. But you quite rightly might be saying to me, if I'm still a minister at that point, you might be rightly saying to me, but actually that does not mean anything because in the Western Isles, in the north of Skye, in Tiree and Islay and places like that, there's been a dramatic reduction in number of speakers. So that is where I'm nervous about putting the wrong targets on the face of the bill that focuses all of the scrutiny on whether or not we've met those targets, rather than having a more flexible approach in strategy. So I would suggest that Parliament holds ministers to account in terms of being required to meet targets, being required to report on those targets, required to gather evidence on those targets, but be very careful about putting the wrong targets on the face of the bill.
Thank you. Michael Mara to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 8.
Thank you, Convener. It's been a very useful discussion, I have to say, and there's much in what all members have said that I agree with. I think there is a core question here about the urgency of the situation. And I have to say, I take some comfort in agreement with what the Deputy First Minister says about setting the wrong targets and policy being driven in the wrong direction. I think that, frankly, happens far, far too often in Scotland. I would say that some of the comments in terms of the process that she describes seems to me a very long-winded version of what we are trying to achieve here. And really a big part of this is about urgency and actually making sure that there is an intent to this legislation that sets it clearly that we have to ensure the survival of the language. I do, however, take on board her points in terms of the complexity that sits below the numbers, and I fully agree with it. In fact, it sits at the heart, I think, of my analysis of both the census and the broader literature around this issue, that it's one thing to have young people leaving school in Gaelic medium education in the central belt of Scotland with some skills in that language who never speak Gaelic again, and another thing entirely to have people who are living in a Gaelic community using Gaelic on a daily basis as part of their culture and as part of the way that they live their lives. And I understand that there is perhaps and could be a tension between the two where government and agencies are driven towards the wrong outcome. So I would hope, I have to say, that rather than leaving some of that detail in, perhaps the detail of it in strategy, that there is space for the government to come round to the idea that we should have a real signal of intent on the face of the bill at stage 3, and that other colleagues might agree with that. It may not be appropriate to set the direct targets that we are describing here, but something that actually gives a sense of the impetus and the urgency around that. Certainly.
John Mason.
I mean, I follow the argument, but would you accept that if it says on the bill that there should be targets, we don't actually need to say in the bill exactly what these targets are, as long as it says in the bill that there will be targets?
I certainly accept that that would be an option. I have some reluctance around where those targets are set, making sure, as I think the Deputy First Minister has set out, that Parliament might have a view as to what those targets should be through a secondary measure or otherwise, and that there would be a broader consultation on them. But I do understand the complexity. But given the comments from across the room on it, I think there seems to be a willingness to develop towards stage 3, and on that basis, certainly.
I am very happy to work with the member in terms of putting into the bill a commitment to targets. One of the areas I would like to see developed is a very localised approach to targets. And in my mind, I envisaged that working in areas of linguistic significance where there was a duty when an area was designated to have essentially a community language development plan which had very specific localised targets that all public bodies working in that area were required to support meeting. Now, that is definitely not necessarily for the bill, although we have put some of that into the amendments around the community areas of linguistic significance. But I wonder if he'd be willing to work with me on both counts, on the sort of protecting of localised aims as well as, so for example, in the North of Skye, it might be that they need more houses. But we can commit to exploring an amendment at stage 3 which commits the government to establishing targets.
Yes. I very much welcome that, Convener, and I'd say I was about to close on the fact that targets must drive actions. So just having another plan that flows from them is insufficient. We have to see the housing, so we have to see the better transport links, and we have to see the jobs in these communities, and that's what will make it thrive. So on that basis, and the assurance I've had, Convener, I don't intend to press the amendments at the moment, and look forward to those discussions ahead of stage 3.
Thank you. Michael Mara seeks to withdraw Amendment 8. Does any member object? No member objects, so Amendment 8 is withdrawn. I call Amendments 9, 10, 11 and 12, all in the name of Ross Greer and all previously debated with Amendment 2. I invite Ross Greer to move Amendments 9 to 12 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 9 to 12? No member has objected. Therefore, the question is that Amendments 9 to 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 13 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 8. Michael Mara to move or not move? Not moved. I call Amendment 14 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 8. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Moved.
Moved. The question is that Amendment 14 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 15 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 8. Michael Mara to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. I call Amendment 16 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 76. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 17 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 2. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 18 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 2. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 78 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 2. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 78 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendments 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24 and 25, all in the name of Ross Greer and all previously debated with Amendment 2. I invite Ross Greer to move Amendments 19 to 25 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
That is moved. Does any member object to a single question being put on Amendments 19 to 25? No member has objected. Therefore, the question is that Amendments 19 to 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 26 in the name of Michael Mara, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Michael Mara to move Amendment 26 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Mara.
Thank you, Convener. So my amendments 26, 27, 30 and 31 in this group would require the Scottish Government to publish draft Gaelic language standards. The bill already requires the Government to carry out a consultation, but the requirement for consultation is only worthwhile as long as there is something upon which to consult. Members of the committee will have gathered that there is a significant public interest in the future of the Gaelic language from a range of stakeholders. I know many have made passionate representations to the committee, both in person and in writing, about how best to preserve and promote the Gaelic language. It's only right that the Government draws on the expertise of those stakeholders when publishing Gaelic language standards. So Amendment 32 holds the Scottish Government to a deadline for the publication of the draft Gaelic language standards. That deadline is within 1 year of the day after royal assent. And the reasons for this particular amendment are twofold. First, in recent years, this Government has taken a very generous approach to its own deadlines, I think it's fair to say, with somewhat nebulous targets such as autumn, giving little certainty to Parliament or to the wider public. And just as I think the Government should set itself clear outcomes against which it can be measured, I also think the Government should be transparent about when it expects to achieve those outcomes. A constant shifting of the goalposts erodes public trust. And secondly, as the committee stated in its Stage 1 report, the Gaelic language is in, I quote, a perilous state. We do not have the luxury of time. You'll perhaps detect a theme, Convener, in terms of where I'm going with many of these amendments. It's really important that the Government hold itself to a timiest deadline for the publication of Gaelic language standards.
The Deputy First Minister to speak to Amendment 28 and other amendments in the group. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much. Well, it's much nicer to be able to talk supportively in this stage of a number of the amendments, not all, but most of them. And I wanted to first touch on Amendment 29, which sets out further detail about the sorts of functions that might be covered by standards in areas of linguistic significance. Again, I think in direct response to the committee, who said an area of linguistic significance is only as important as the changes it creates for communities through that. So those areas will obviously be designated in recognition of the demographic strength of Gaelic within them and or the level of Gaelic activity. And it's recognised that those qualities intersect with so many other aspects of community and economic development within those areas, as the Short Life Working Group on economic and social opportunities for Gaelic highlighted. It's correct, therefore, that the Scottish Languages Bill should provide further detail for public authorities on the sorts of provisions that might be made in standards within an area of linguistic significance. That amendment also ensures that language planning and development is tied in with other objectives such as community planning and economic development. I am so often struck by the fact that the aims and aspirations of Gaelic speakers in some of these traditional communities are very much intertwined with the desires and aspirations for those that don't have Gaelic language. And I think issues around infrastructure, transport and so on are very obvious ones. That is consistent with other measures within the bill as well as other Scottish Government strategies. Amendment 28 provides further clarity on the nature of provision that could be included in the standards. Amendments 26 and 27 convert the power to make standards into a duty. I certainly was always of the view that it was always the intention to exercise this power. We are content to support those amendments for the reasons that Michael Mara has set out in terms of the urgency of the situation. Amendments 30 and 31 require an additional procedural step of laying regulations in draft form for consultation, and I am a big fan of consulting on things, so very happy to support that. Amendment 32 is perhaps where we have a slightly different view. I take on board Michael Mara's points around the perilous state of the language, the urgency of the response required. It imposes a strict time limit of 1 year from royal assent for first laying of those regulations. We feel that could be too restrictive. We want to be able to develop the standards, the requirements properly in consultation with stakeholders as required by the existing provisions of the bill, which are now enhanced by Michael Mara's amendments 30 and 31. Amendment 32 could hit a number of challenges in terms of meeting that time limit, not all of which is within the government's control. For example, it's quite likely that on this occasion it would run into the end of the parliamentary session for the current 5-year term and therefore run the risk of making the meeting of that time limit challenging or impossible, just in light of coming to the end of the parliamentary term on this occasion. So the spirit of it is well understood, but we feel like it's not going to always be possible, and therefore those regulations could be too restrictive. Yeah.
Thank you. Just on Michael Mara's Amendment 32, would you be able to, through the convener, would the Cabinet Secretary be able to clarify the Government's expected timescale? If within a year of royal assent is too soon, or do you think it would be realistic to be within a year of enactment, or do you have an indicative timescale at this point?
Yeah, or we could largely keep to it but adapt it to 2 years just to give that flexibility and in terms of some of those parliamentary moments. So I think the idea of keeping government to account for actually laying this as quickly as possible is right. And 2 years would just give a little bit more flexibility. It would be my aspiration to deliver on that as soon as possible. But we could adapt it. Michael Barr.
I appreciate the Cabinet Secretary giving way. I suppose my concern regarding moving to 2 years is that quite clearly pushes this into the next parliamentary term, and goodness only knows what that looks like at this moment in time. Things are up in a great flux. I think if there's to be action taken on this, I would hope that we can actually not just pass this bill, but make sure that there is substantive action taken within this parliamentary term. So I do have concerns about moving to a 2-year time frame on this basis. I suppose in the spirit of negotiation, is there anything that could we go a bit further? Could we find something at 18 months perhaps, or essentially prior to May 2026?
Yeah, we could definitely look at it. I'm conscious that we're in December 24. Purda is February 26 probably. So this is at stage 2. We have to get to stage 3. We then need royal assent. And so just in the spirit of realism, once you get royal assent, which is normally a couple of weeks, sometimes a month, after stage 3, you're then into like quite a tight year. So I think even if it were 18 months, you're looking at early next parliamentary term. So maybe the requirement is for us to demonstrate progress in the interim. So short of laying the regulations, we could do something around 1 year from coming into force, that kind of thing. Is that what we could definitely explore it, rather than sort of coming up with compromises. As I sit here, I commit to coming up with a compromise prior to stage 3 that makes sense. Just really briefly, Amendments 79 and 80 require Scottish ministers to publish the results of consultations on Gaelic language standards and guidance. And not only am I hugely supportive of consultation, I'm even more supportive of publishing the results of that consultation. So very happy to support those amendments. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Ross Greer to speak to Amendment 79 and other amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. These are like amendments that I've moved before. They're proposals from the Law Society. The rationale for them I've already explained in terms of transparency. The Cabinet Secretary has already indicated the government's support, so I don't think I need to add any more at this stage.
To wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 26.
Thank you, Convener. Yeah, another useful discussion. Happy to obviously support Ross Greer's at 79 and 80 and welcome the support from the Cabinet Secretary. And given her indications around the 32, I'm happy to indicate at this point that I would tend to withdraw and have that broader conversation with the Deputy First Minister as to how we might progress it. But I would press Amendment 26.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Sorry?
That was withdrawn.
No, I believe Michael Mara moved Amendment 26.
I
He was speaking about Amendment 32, I believe.
Yeah.
Yep. No, that's fine. I'll just ask the question again. The question is that Amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. I call Amendment 27 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 26. Michael Mara, to move or not move?
Moved.
That is moved. Therefore, the question is that Amendment 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 28 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 26. Deputy First Minister, to move formally. The question is that Amendment 28 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 29 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 26. Deputy First Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
That's moved. The question is that Amendment 29 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 30 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 26. Michael Mara, to move or not move?
Moved.
That's moved. So the question is that Amendment 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 31 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 26. Michael Mara, to move or not move?
Moved.
That's moved. The question is that Amendment 31 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. I call Amendment 79 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 26. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Moved.
That's moved. So the question is that Amendment 79 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 32 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 26. Michael Mara, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 33 in the name of Ross Greer, grouped with Amendments 34, 54 and 68, and I would point out that if Amendment 33 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 34 because of a preemption. Ross Greer, to move Amendment 33 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. So, starting off with Amendment 33, I should say that these amendments all relate to the duties of the relevant public authorities. 33 is because the current language in this section of the bill is to have regard to the desirability of promoting, facilitating and supporting the use of the Gaelic language and developing and encouraging Gaelic culture. I think that desirability is too weak, frankly, so the alternative wording here that I've proposed is still caveated. It still says appropriate in the circumstances and reasonably practicable, but I think that's a bit more of an objective test than desirable. Desirable to me feels too subjective, and surely we are deciding now that this is all broadly desirable and that the duties that we are putting here should be about something a bit more objective about whether it is appropriate in their circumstances. We're the ones to decide on desirability here. So I think that phrasing is a bit too weak for me, and I'm proposing replacing it with something a bit more objective in 33. 54 is a bit more substantive. So this is about expanding the obligations on public bodies that have existed since 2005 under the 2005 Gaelic Language Act to colleges, universities, ScotRail, Caledonian Sleeper and Scottish Water. At the moment, it does appear to be ambiguous whether colleges and universities are already covered. If they are, it's not working, though. There are only a couple who have effective Gaelic language plans, so clearly clarifying that would be useful. The public companies, ScotRail, the Caledonian Sleeper and particularly Scottish Water, are effectively public bodies for the purposes that we're talking about here. So I think they should have the same obligations as other public bodies in that sense. So that's the rationale behind expanding the number of bodies covered by those provisions in 54. Yes.
I thank the member for taking the intervention. And I'm minded to be supportive. I'm keen to know what conversations has the member had with further and higher education institutions on this and the implications that bringing them into this explicitly would have on the work that they do.
Ross Greer.
Thanks. I'm grateful for that. So the conversations I've had, albeit largely informal conversations, in those no one has raised concerns with me about it. As it so happened, those I engaged with the most turned out to be those with Gaelic language plans, and it was perhaps more of a struggle to be able to engage with those who didn't have them. No one has raised any concerns with me about this. I'll be the first to admit that I have not spoken to every institution in that regard, but no concerns have been raised ahead of this, and this was an amendment that I lodged relatively early in the process. I certainly haven't had any objections raised by the relevant College of Scotland or University of Scotland who I raised this with previously. And just finally on 68, so I think the past experience here, and that's much of the reason why we're here discussing this bill and relevant to the discussions that have just taken place between Michael Mara and the Cabinet Secretary and the urgency of this. Past experience shows us that there is probably going to often be a reluctance to fulfil these duties, that they will not be prioritised in the way that we would wish to see. So 68 simply gives ministers stronger enforcement powers in this regard. So they're largely replicated from the 1980 Education Act. So these are not unprecedented. This is, to a significant extent, a copy and paste of a set of enforcement powers that ministers already have into this section, simply to ensure, hopefully we don't get to that point. As I said, past precedent would indicate that that's not unlikely. I certainly want ministers to be in a place where they would be able to take effective action. If any public body, even if we take aside the content and the purpose of this bill, if any public body is failing in the duties that Parliament has placed upon it, I would want ministers to have the power to ensure that that is rectified. So that is the rationale behind 68.
Thank you. Emma Roddick has submitted amendments and they will be spoken to by Jackie Dunbar. So I call Jackie Dunbar to speak to Amendment 34 and other amendments in the group. Jackie Dunbar.
Thank you, Convener. I'll move Amendment 34 in Emma Roddick's name and on her behalf, as she's unable to attend this morning due to being at another committee. Representatives from speaker communities have expressed concern that the duty set out in the bill for relevant public authorities to have regard to the desirability of taking action in respect of Gaelic language and culture is not strong enough, and that the reference to desirability could in some way suggest that taking action to promote, facilitate or support Gaelic might not be desirable. The amendment therefore removes the reference to desirability. A duty to have regard to taking these actions will be clear for public authorities whilst addressing stakeholder concerns. I believe that Ross Greer's Amendment 33 is seeking to achieve the same aim, but it imposes a more complex two-stage test which might be less clear for public authorities seeking to comply with the duty. I therefore hope that members will support Amendment 34 in preference to Mr Greer's amendment.
Thank you. And Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much. I start with Amendment 33 and 34. I do understand the importance of ensuring that the duties we place on relevant public authorities strikes the correct balance. Amendment 34 proposed by Emma Roddick would achieve this. A duty to have regard to something is a commonly used formulation in law, and the removal of reference to desirability of having regard to Gaelic language and culture makes the duty more direct and therefore stronger, whilst still allowing relevant public authorities flexibility and autonomy to consider what action they should take in their particular circumstances. The two-stage test in Ross Greer's Amendment 33 is less clear for our reading. I appreciate that the wording appears in the 2005 Act, but it's in a very different context of Bors na Gaelic giving advice and assistance to authorities, and I'm concerned that that test would be more complex for authorities to apply than the simple have regard test, which Emma Roddick's amendment would achieve. And so I would ask members to support Amendment 34, and on this occasion would not be able to support Amendment 33. Oh, sorry, and I'm going to keep going. Turning to Amendment 54, and the relevant public authorities to be included in the scope of the Gaelic Language Act. I should say that this is another example of trying to support as many amendments as possible, either now or at stage 3, because well, I'll come on to the reasons why. The Scottish Government's position is that the bodies Scottish Rail Holdings and Scottish Water are already included in the scope of the Act by virtue of the use of the definition Scottish Public Authority, and expressly specifying them we feel is unnecessary and might create doubt, and even a narrowing of the definition by suggesting that bodies must be expressly mentioned to be subject to the Act. Colleges in Scotland are already classed as part of the public sector and have some functions to which the duties in the Gaelic Language Act, as amended by the bill, will apply. And in 2005, in the Gaelic Act, there was an assumption that universities would be covered. They have a mix of public and private functions, and their private functions are obviously not the concern of the bill, but there are undoubtedly public functions within the sector which should be exercised with an appreciation of the Gaelic language. And indeed, you see that happening already. Just last week, Edinburgh University launched its refreshed Gaelic language plan. And that's a great example of how universities, through their activities, run and how they run the internal corporate aspects of their institutions and how they provide for their student populations, can act positively for Gaelic. Happy to take an intervention.
Cabinet Secretary for that, and recognising, as has been said, that there was an assumption that colleges and universities were included under the 2005 Act, and best practice there has been mentioned, but I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would reflect on the fact that that hasn't been consistent, that there has been doubt and there has not been a consistent application of the 2005 Act by colleges and universities, and that therefore some level of clarity is clearly required.
Thank you very much. I think that is a compelling argument in terms of clarifying to balance out with some of those concerns I raised in my opening paragraphs, just around whether things need to be expressly referenced in order to be captured. And of course, our view is that all of the public sector should be captured. All of the actions that universities are engaged with just now contribute to the wider public visibility, respect and opportunities for usage of the language in Scotland. We are, through this bill as well, taking a power to require the Scottish Funding Council to impose conditions on the funding they provide to universities to ensure that funds are used to enable, encourage and increase participation in higher education in the Gaelic language, and that will ensure the objective of improving Gaelic participation is met without risking the independence of universities. And so I'm content to support Mr Greer's Amendment 54 here, which could put coverage of the Act beyond doubt, I think is the argument here. Finally, turning to Amendment 68, I am aware of the calls for enhanced enforcement mechanisms to reinforce the duties in the Gaelic Language Act. Indeed, I think that is concern that has been raised by a number of members, including Michael Mara in the last debate we had. I thank the member, Ross Greer, for explaining his amendment. I'm happy to support that amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 33.
Thanks, Convener. Grateful for the debate on this, and to Emma Roddick for her amendment, and Jackie Dunbar for explaining the rationale behind it. So on that basis, and for the simplicity of 34 versus 33, I'm happy not to press 33, but with the Cabinet Secretary's support, I will press 54 and 68.
Okay, so Ross Greer seeks to withdraw Amendment 33. Does any member object? No member has objected, so Amendment 33 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 34 in the name of Emma Roddick, already debated with Amendment 33. Jackie Dunbar, to move or not move?
Move.
The amendment is moved. The question is that Amendment 34 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 35 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 76. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 80 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 26. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 80 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 36 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 2. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
The amendment is moved, so the question is that Amendment 36 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 37 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 8. Michael Mara, to move or not move?
Moved.
The amendment is moved, so the question is that Amendment 37 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed, therefore there will be a division. So on Amendment 37, can I ask those to indicate if they are in favour of Amendment 37? Okay. And those against Amendment 37? The result of the vote on Amendment 37 is 4-2 against 8. Amendment 37 is therefore not agreed to. I call Amendment 38 in the name of Ross Greer, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Ross Greer, to move Amendment 38 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. So amendments 38, 39, 40, 44, 45 and 46 require annual reporting with what I think is appropriate flexibility. So, for example, 38 and 44 use the phrase "as soon as reasonably practicable" after each financial year. And this is to reflect the urgency of the situation that we've already discussed, that the last set of census figures beneath the Duolingo figure that boosted overall Gaelic language skills, the obvious decline in Gaelic as a spoken or community language. So my intention with these amendments is not to be overly prescriptive. These are not amendments about everything that should be included in the contents of the reports, but it is to clarify that I believe there is a need for regular reporting, for accountability and for us to be confident that progress is actually being made here. So they're simple enough amendments, I hope. I recognise, based on the debate that we've had previously around the balance that we need to strike here between not placing too onerous a duty versus the need for us to be regularly appraised of the situation. My hope here is that we'd be able to find some kind of agreement around this.
Deputy First Minister.
Thanks very much. Báirteanna Gaelic reporting on Scottish Ministers' progress and on public authority compliance is very important. It's essential, and I think Ross Greer is right to highlight it as an important issue, which I hope Parliament continues to take an interest in. Our issue here is to try and avoid a situation where Báirteanna Gaelic spend the whole year producing the next report, which distracts as a small and nimble organisation. I would like as much of their time and effort to be deployed in promoting Gaelic and supporting communities rather than producing reports. And so we feel like the annual timeframe proposed would be very demanding for the particular task that Ross Greer has highlighted. And it's a lot to do in a relatively short time, thus reducing both the quality of the information collected and hampering any follow-up activity required. So our preference would be to allow the Borscht discretion to set its own reporting timescales, And on that basis, an annual timescale, we feel, is an overly onerous duty and potentially counterproductive, which is why we reluctantly can't support Ross Greer's amendments.
Intervene?
Yep.
Ross Greer.
I understand entirely the Scottish Government's perspective and the need to strike a balance here, particularly for a relatively small public body. But given the reason we're here, the urgency of the situation, could I probe as to whether there is any scope perhaps for compromise at stage 3 to allow a reasonable level of discretion for the board, but perhaps to set a minimum timescale, not necessarily a year, but to be purely to speculate at this point, no less than every 2 years or 3 years. Is there space for the government to be amenable to some kind of amendment that would at least set a minimum standard?
I wonder if this is something that we should consider jointly with my commitment to Michael Mara earlier about regular reporting and regular evidence gathering for monitoring progress. Because actually, if I understand the member correctly, what you really want to find out is whether or not we're making progress according to the aspirations that we've set. And the question I would have is, who is best to do the reporting, who is best to do the evidence gathering, and how do we make sure that evidence is robust? Because it's one thing to write a report which just highlights all the activities that have been undertaken in a year, but it's quite another to write a report which monitors whether those activities have been in any way impactful. So I wonder whether there's a bit of a crossover here in terms of the members' aspirations, and I'd be very happy to consider the issue in the round of who's best to report, on what basis, how frequently, and what evidence they use.
Okay, thank you. Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 38.
Thanks. Convener, on the basis of the last comments there from the Cabinet Secretary, I'm happy not to move Amendment 38 or the others in this group that have moved, and we'll look to reach some form of agreement ahead of stage 3.
Okay, Ross Greer seeks to withdraw Amendment 38. Does any member object? No member objects, so Amendment 38 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 39 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated, with Amendment 38. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 40 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 38. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 41 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 8. Michael Mara to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 42 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 2. Ross Greer to move or not move? That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 42 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 43 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 8. Michael Mara to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call Amendment 44 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 38. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Not move.
I call Amendment 45 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 38. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 46 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 38. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. Therefore, the question is that Section 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and I think that's probably a suitable time to have a short break. So I will suspend the meeting for about 15 minutes. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. I call Amendment 47 in the name of Michael Mara, group with Amendments 55 and 67. Michael Mara to move Amendment 47 and speak to all amendments in the group. Michael.
Thank you, Convener, and I move Amendment 47 in my name. It does require ministers to prepare a biannual report on the number of Gaelic speakers in Scotland, and it ties in, I think, with some of the discussion that we were having prior to the break in the previous grouping of amendments, but also to my comments earlier in the morning regarding amendments to insert measurable outcomes on Gaelic. So I do recognise that there's not one single measure by which the status of the Gaelic language it can be judged in terms of its health, but surely the most critical one is the number of speakers in Scotland. And the census, I think, as we've already explored this morning, is not an adequate means of measuring the number of Gaelic speakers in Scotland. I think the Deputy First Minister and other members of the committee have recognised that and set that out. But given the warnings that the committee has heard from authoritative experts about the decline in the number of Gaelic speakers and the risks to the future of the language in the next 5 to 10 years, it is not acceptable for government or parliament to wait another decade for another census. To put it bluntly, by that time, the next census, it may well be too late. And Gaelic communities need concrete actions to be taken now, and there must be a means for Parliament to judge in a timely manner whether or not the actions being taken by government are having the desired effect. So many members of the Gaelic community have expressed to me that since I think this is the first piece of legislation since 2004, and that there's been a long time for consideration and in-depth consideration of the health of the language in their communities to be considered in the round in Parliament, and it cannot wait that long again, or even half that time. We need to make sure that we hold the government to account on a regular basis on this, but more particularly we have to assess whether the actions are actually working, so that we can support the government in getting new means by which to save Gaelic in Scotland. On Amendment 67, I'm yet to decide whether to press it, but I wanted to set out, as I mentioned earlier, that Scottish Labour is seriously concerned about the limited scope of the legislation. It was the bill was originally conceived, it was clear, as an education bill, and fear that it may, in the end, represent a missed opportunity to revitalise the Gaelic language in communities where it's traditionally spoken. So I'm looking for recognition from the Deputy First Minister today that this bill does not represent the full extent of the government's ambition for Gaelic, that we have to move well beyond this, and that assurances that the government will seek at the earliest opportunity to take more concrete actions to address the key economic questions of housing, jobs and infrastructure in the Gaelic communities. Certainly.
I'm grateful for taking the intervention. Just on Amendment 67 and touching on some of the issues we've looked at so far, I'm just wondering if whether the reporting requirements would be better placed against the national strategy rather than against the bill, or what would then be the Act, given Parliament has a role in deciding what it does and does not want to do post-legislative scrutiny on, but the strategy itself should hopefully include much more in the way of the specific actions whose impact we're trying to measure here.
I think that's fair. It could be one way to do it. The way that I presented in the amendment, and whether considering whether to push it to have it on the face of the bill and wait for the reaction to it, is to be very specific about the broader context that exists within. So I think that the issue at the moment is that we're essentially looking at what in the main is a piece of education legislation, feels to me, and we have to, I think, specifically recognise and address the fact that the key factors that are going to underpin the survival of the language are not purely educational, that there are broader issues, and that a strategy has to take account of that, and the government should present it now. I would take perhaps the criticism around this, or the constructive criticism, perhaps there's a duplication between a strategy and these reporting mechanisms, and there might be a case to find a crossover between the two. But it's to try and see the issue in all its complexity and in the round, but setting out the key data that's associated with it. So I close, Convener, by saying that I think the recent work from the government, the Short Life Working Group, was welcome, and I think it set out some of these themes. But I'm afraid already that feels to me like it's gathering dust on a shelf in St Andrew's House. and that we need to have the opportunities, both in Parliament and in communities, to hold government to account for the analysis that is produced. Some of the, I think, the really positive identified issues within that pertain to these issues of economic survival. And so I think there's a recent track record of some good work, but we need the opportunities to make sure that we can hold government to account on it. So thank you, Kabir.
Thank you. Deputy First Minister, speak to Amendment 55 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you very much. And again, my thanks for these amendments. Let me start with 55. Since the passing of the Gaelic Language Act in 2005, data gathering in relation to Gaelic policy has been an issue. And I think we have heard about the consequences of the lack of data in this debate so far, but also in previous debates. And this amendment will improve the quality and the extent of data gathering from public bodies in relation to their Gaelic policies and implementation of the Gaelic language strategy. It will also create a framework for providing training and encouraging or assisting others to do those tasks. Those actions will be to the benefit of the strategy's implementation and address a concern raised about the assessment of Gaelic language plans since the passage of the 2005 Act. So we do recognise the importance of data and of research. On Amendment 47,
Would you recognise that in this form of analysis that the independence of that analysis is very important? And I would cite the landmark publication of the Crisis in the Vernacular Community that I think had proven to be controversial in policy circles as well, and that some of I think the well-founded and deeply researched issues that were within that showing the depth of the decline, whereas it might be a point of debate, I think that independent research that holds the policy community and the government to account in terms of its own actions is vitally important as well. So directly commissioned work from the government in that regard may have its limitations.
I think the member touches on something which is broader than this bill, which is around the extent of independent research generally when it comes to Gaelic, and also the work within sort of Civic Scotland, the policy work around in Civic Scotland, considering policy improvements, policy changes. I'm very conscious that in a number of other spheres of debate, we often are extensively lobbied by a number of different organisations that have contributed significant time, effort to researching, evidencing, data gathering on particularly policy issues. And I would like to see that developed further in Gaelic. But the member is absolutely right. I don't think that should be owned by government, because I think government should be the recipients of that either lobbying or of that challenge. So I do agree it is important to hear a robust debate on Gaelic policy, and I would commend the committee for what they have done in even gathering evidence from a number of stakeholders on this. But I would hope that that doesn't end with the passage of this bill, that it continues, and I could commend a number of different organisations, not least Misneach, who have done quite a lot of work in that space. On the...
Ross Greer.
Grateful. Just Amendment 55 on the face of it sounds positive to me, and of course more research, more data collection is valuable. I suppose my question would just be about the necessity of it. Is there currently a barrier to ministers being able to commission this kind of research and collect this kind of data, or is this simply a clarifying amendment? There's nothing that currently says you can't, but this is just to make it absolutely clear that you can.
Deputy First Minister.
My understanding is that is correct. That previously, when it came to the previous Act, we are aware that data gathering has been a challenge, and we do need to do more around data gathering. And it was also a criticism that was flagged by the committee in terms of the robustness of the data that we are gathering. So I think it was a frequent refrain from the committee. So it highlights our commitment to doing this. In terms of the other amendments, so Amendment 47, my reading is that it essentially places a requirement to report at the level that the census reports every 2 years on the number of Gaelic speakers. Now, whilst not arguing with the desire to have far more frequent reporting on progress amongst Gaelic speakers, our sense is that, considering it takes quite a long time to do the census, the strict schedules within Amendment 47 does require quite a significant amount of resource and staffing. And again, the risk is that that distracts from the urgent need for action by focusing resources on reporting rather than delivery. There are also deeper questions of the methodology involved in such reporting, which would have to be settled before making it a requirement of ministers. The reason for our Amendment 55 is to address that issue, but in a way that is less onerous and hopefully provides a greater depth of information. With Amendment 67, the desire here for more information, that obviously requires a reporting on particular issues. The Gaelic Language Strategy and Standards is the way to assess the issues which would affect the language and its communities. There's a concern that the requirements of this amendment would require, again, a significant resource investment that focuses efforts away from the delivery of the bill's measures. We again have brought forward Amendment 55 to try and address that issue. I've previously stated that the challenges facing Gaelic require action across a range of issues that does relate to social and economic matters as much as the themes of education, institutional planning and community development, which will be the main focus of this bill. Interventions are underway which indicate the government's recognition of the need to provide a comprehensive approach to the language. Michael Mara.
Thank you, Convener. So, in relation to your first point regarding the census level activity, I don't think it necessarily does stipulate that that would be required in exactly that way. You know, there are different methodologies by which the numbers could be gauged, and frankly, more usefully, I mean, the Deputy First Minister will be aware of, like, perhaps we could put it the rather novel way that the Scottish Government conducted the most recent census, slightly suboptimal, I think it's fair to say, in comparison to the rest of the UK, but using modelling options based on authoritative data sampling, I think are different ways that you could do it rather than the household approach, which was actually, in essence, abandoned by the Scottish Government, I think, erroneously in the last census. So there are options, I think, by which this could be gathered. So I don't really hold to that point. So reflections from Deputy First Minister in that regard would be useful. And more broadly on your point relating to 67 and my broader concerns and how we'd see those reported on. When would I take the Minister's comments, but when would she see Parliament's opportunity to hold her to account on the actions that are set out in this? So yes, the data gathering, you've set that out in 55, but when would we see that? How regularly, and when we would be able to make sure that there was scrutiny and see whether there was success? Yeah.
So a couple of points. I know I said this in a previous debate, but what I would envisage is that, particularly in areas of linguistic significance, there would be a very intensive monitoring exercise required. So, if you just want to take the top level of figures, which is the overall number, then that can tell you different stories. But by and large, it's currently telling us that there's a rise in the number of speakers. Now, we around this table know that that doesn't tell the full story, because that general national rise in people with Gaelic speaking skills may mask what is happening in traditional communities. And those traditional communities, we believe, would be the foremost contenders to be areas of linguistic significance. And I would envisage there being a requirement on public bodies, with the support of Bart na Gaelic, to evaluate the number of speakers, to set out targets, and to monitor the success of those targets, which would inevitably require consideration of the number of speakers. So their primary responsibility would be to increase the number of speakers and increase the depth of that understanding and that fluency in those local areas. And if we haven't already, looking at a requirement to report in those areas. That is very intensively local. But the second thing is, on parliamentary scrutiny, I think that if there is I dare not criticise Parliament, but if there is a criticism of government here, I think there's also perhaps a criticism of Parliament for not taking sufficient interest in some of these issues, which this committee has done a lot to repair, to its credit. And I think the way that the committee has taken its evidence is commendable. But I would like to see, personally, if a government minister dare say this, like to see Parliament taking more of an interest in scrutinising the progress and the success of Gaelic language policies more regularly, and asking ministers to report on or to give further information or to be basically scrutinised and held to account for what is or not happening. So there's nothing that stops that from happening right now. Yep.
But the Minister would recognise that part of the significant reason for that is just a factor of the numbers, that we have a very small Gaelic community as a component part of our overall population, that in many parts of the country Gaelic is not spoken widely, or in some areas not at all. The reality, the political reality of that is that there's a small group, of which you are one, of somebody who represents a Gaelic-speaking community, and that in essence the weight of those, the concerns of other parts of the country, cannot be allowed to drown out this vital issue. And so Parliament will tend towards reflecting on that. That's why legislation is an opportunity to put in place moments in a parliamentary calendar when reports might be tabled, where there are opportunities where we can have a rhythm of scrutiny that doesn't lend itself to a moment of panic in 10 years' time when the census comes out that shows us a yet further precipitous decline. So it's about the legislation and the purpose of trying to give Parliament that moment, particularly for what is, by its very nature, a minority issue.
Which is a very compelling argument for why I believe this reporting should be done on an intensely localised basis. So I think that the key here is to monitor progress within local communities. So even if you were to take a single island, the island of Skye, and to look at the figures across that island, would not tell you much about the health of the communities where it still is where the population is highly dense in the north of the island. And I think that where we might want to move further is to how we report to Parliament regularly on the areas of linguistic significance. Because that, to my mind, basically the progress according to the plans that have been established in those very intensely local areas as to whether they are proving to be successful or not. That's where I wholeheartedly agree with the member, and where I think doing it purely on a national basis it doesn't meet the aims and the ambitions. So if I take the member's Amendment 67, where it looks at the extent to which certain issues have been addressed by the provisions, the other issues that exist in relation to Gaelic communities, the use of the Gaelic language. All of these are very, very laudable aims, but actually they are most relevant when applied to traditional Gaelic-speaking communities. And I think that that should be done with regard to those areas. And at the moment, the position would be that if an area was designated as an area of linguistic significance, with a plan in place, that plan should then be monitored after consultation with local stakeholders. So it's more the case of, again, on 47, if we are... I take his point that it doesn't have to be sort of census methodology, but if there is a requirement to publish a report on the number of Gaelic language speakers in Scotland every 2 years, you may actually see very little fluctuation in those figures. You may see, for example, more children learning Gaelic, but it doesn't. It's a lot. It's very resource intensive for getting a quite high level view. So, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, there may be merit in looking at how we include more parliamentary scrutiny in the reporting without going down the route of national high-level census figures every 2 years. And on 67, where it's looking at the reporting of the specific issues that this Act is seeking to address, I think that is done at an intensely local level. So if the Gaelic plan, community plan for a particular locality says the 3 priorities here are X, Y and Z, well, how does Parliament scrutinise whether or not any of these plans are successful? There could be an amendment to that effect as part of the areas of linguistic significance requirements.
And you've concluded?
I think I have.
Great, thank you. I call on Mike O'Mara to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 47.
Thank the Minister for the comments. I think there's some common ground here regarding the lack of frequency of reporting of the status of the state of the language in terms of the level. We sense, I think, moving towards a commitment to perhaps do something around what you're saying, reporting around the areas of linguistic significance, convener, within that area. On that basis, I think if there's a commitment to a further discussion ahead of stage 3 as to how we might make sure that that's in the bill, then I'd be happy not to move on that basis.
So you just check you wish to withdraw Amendment 47?
I do.
Yep. So Mike O'Mara seeks to withdraw Amendment 47. Does any member object? There is no objection, so Amendment 47 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 48 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 2. Ross Greer, to move or not move? The question is that Amendment 48 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. I call Amendment 49 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 2. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved, so the question is that Amendment 49 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 50 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 76. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
That's moved. So the question is that Amendment 50 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 51 in the name of Ross Greer, grouped with Amendments 52 and 53. Ross Greer, to move Amendment 51 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I should clarify at the outset these particular amendments are only relevant in a situation where a report has been produced concluding that a public body has failed in its duties under the bill, what would then be the Act, and that the Scottish Government agrees with that. I think hopefully those circumstances will be incredibly limited, but that is a serious set of circumstances where Parliament passes law. We expect public bodies to align with that and to fulfil their duties under it. So, whilst hoping that this is a very rare occurrence, I think it is appropriate if we are in that situation where the report has been produced, concluding that a public body has failed in its duties, where the government agrees with that, these amendments simply clarify that the government must direct that organisation to implement the measures that were included in its plan by a certain date. I think that giving them a timescale in which to do that is important for making sure that the duties are actually fulfilled. These are duties that will only be upon them if Parliament has agreed to this. So therefore, duties that have that legitimacy and weight of law behind them. But also I think the timescale there is important for the confidence of the community that government is committed to taking effective action to make sure that what has been campaigned for and agreed by Parliament is actually fulfilled. So 51 does that. 52 is simply to clean up that section of the bill.
I call the Deputy First Minister to speak to Amendment 53 and other amendments in the group. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you. So the amendments provide a mechanism, that's Amendment 51 and 52, the amendments provide a mechanism to ensure that Barshna Gaelic recommendations are carried out with the support of Scottish ministers. They respond to the wishes of Gaelic interests that Scottish public authorities would implement the commitments in their Gaelic language plans, and I'm happy to support those amendments. Amendment 53 will remove part of Section 9 of the bill. It will remove a direction-making power which Scottish ministers were proposing to take, but which the DPLR committee asked to be reconsidered, and the Scottish Government agrees that the objectives of this power could be achieved by other means, and in particular the power to set standards which authorities will have to follow and the power to give guidance. I therefore propose to remove it from the bill. And I believe that's the end of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Ross Greer, to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 51.
Nothing further to add. I'll be pressing Amendment 51.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 51 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 52 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 51. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 52 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 53 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 51. Deputy First Minister, to move formally?
Moved.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 53 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
We are agreed. The question is that Section 9 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 54 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 33. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 54 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 55 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 47. Deputy First Minister, to move formally?
Moved.
That is moved. The question is that Amendment 55 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 56 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, grouped with Amendment 73. Deputy First Minister, to move Amendment 56 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thanks very much. So these amendments provide clear standalone powers under which Scottish ministers can provide financial assistance to any person for the purposes of promoting, facilitation and supporting the use of Gaelic and Scots. Financial assistance can include grants and loans. There are a range of interventions which can support minority languages which do require financial assistance, and while current support for the sector tends to use powers primarily provided for education or for culture, for example, those fresh powers ensure that there are bespoke powers which Scottish ministers can turn to and use for language planning purposes across a range of sectors, and ensure that the necessary powers to support the language are in place for a strong future. They are, again, in response to comments that were made by the committee and from stakeholders about the extent of interventions that would be available to government and to other public bodies when supporting the language within a particular local area. And one of the comments that was made was around economic interventions, for example, to support businesses or to support enterprises or initiatives or entrepreneurs who are working in an area which is suffering from depopulation and which could benefit from support. And so these...
Yes. Take an intervention, please. Thank you, Convener. And I'm minded, given the committee's conclusions around this aspect, to support this, but I have a couple of questions around it. I wonder if the Deputy First Minister could help. The first question I have is can the Deputy First Minister set out why the financial resolution came quite so late in the process on this bill? Secondly, can the Deputy First Minister set out why this is specifically needed in relation to this bill rather than in the ordinary workings of Parliament through the budgetary process, where the government can attach finance to do effectively what it wants to do through the budget process? So it would be helpful to have some clarity on both those points.
Deputy First Minister.
Thanks very much. So on the last point, on the financial memorandum, my apologies if, in terms of it coming later in the day, to use her words. I think there's been such a lot of movement with amendments that we wanted to make sure that it was as accurate as possible, and so it does have to reflect amendments and how we intend to amend the bill. So that would be the reason for the revised financial memorandum. On her other questions, I suppose one of the tensions with this whole bill is that members have rightly been asking and quite rightly pressing, and so have external stakeholders been pressing, for this bill to mean more. I think the word that's been used is to be strengthened, for areas of linguistic significance to really mean something. And in many cases that sort of points to a number of community interventions which actually we probably can do independently of the bill. But because the criticism has quite rightly been strengthen the bill with actual activity activities, interventions that are required, we have sought to strengthen the bill so that on the face of the bill, without waiting for standards or the strategy, there are things that we can point to that we actively will be able to do. So there's already a range of grant-making powers designed for culture, for education and for heritage, but what had been perhaps missing is economic activity. So for, at the end of the day, jobs, businesses, the cornerstone of any community. And so this enables us to highlight, point to specific interventions that could be now taken, which probably could have been taken already, but we're strengthening the bill in order to take active, more active series of interventions in areas of linguistic significance, if that makes sense.
That was an intervention. I don't know if you want to continue.
I think I was done.
Okay, thank you. Anything to say by way of wind-up? Nope. The question is that Amendment 56 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Sections 10 and 11 are agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 81 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, grouped with Amendments 82, 83, 57 and 58. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move Amendment 81 and speak to all amendments in the group. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the convener. These amendments are to recognise that in Scotland we have, when we take pride in our teaching profession and in the standards to which they work. And many of those standards, of course, are supported and guided by legislation and also standards set out by the General Teaching Council for Scotland. As it stands, the bill doesn't fully recognise them in terms of the fact that the standards changing to the standards that are proposed in the bill around Gaelic, it's unclear about how that will relate to the way in which the GTCS carry out their functions on the standards relating to education more broadly. So my amendments 81 and 82 seek to clarify that. 81 specifically sets out the standards of education and training appropriate for school teachers and the conduct and professional competence expected of teachers as per the GTCS standards. And Amendment 82 requires the government to make sure that the General Teaching Council for Scotland are part of the consultation, and it makes that explicit in the legislation, clarifying and preserving the role that we've had in Scotland for some time now that recognises the graduate profession of teachers.
Okay, thank you. I call on Ross Greer to speak to Amendment 83 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. 83 is again just this proposal from the Law Society that there's a requirement to publish the results of consultations, which has been well covered as I've moved that amendment in various relevant sections up until now, so I won't repeat that. But 57 in my name refers to a section of the bill that currently says ministers may give guidance to public authorities about Gaelic education, but that's really the whole at the core of why we're here. So I don't believe that should be optional. I think we should change may to must. We have recognised now for almost 20 years, Gaelic is one of our national languages. I believe that there is a consensus that shouldn't change for the foreseeable future. If we ever end up at a point in the future where ministers of a government believe that it's no longer necessary to provide guidance on Gaelic education, I think that is a significant enough change that it should have to come to Parliament on that, therefore that they would require to change legislation. So it's a simple proposal there to change may to must to reflect the fact that I believe that's necessary, and it's at the core of this bill and why the bill was necessary in the first place.
Thank you. And I call the Deputy First Minister to speak to Amendment 58 and other amendments in the group. Deputy First Minister.
Thanks very much. So thanks to Pam Duncan-Glancy for explaining the purposes of Amendments 81 and 82. Among the overarching aims of the Scottish Languages Bill is to put in place a new strategic approach to Gaelic education. That's in recognition of the unique challenges faced by minority language within a national education system. And to tackle those challenges, it is necessary that standards and regulations for Gaelic education be formed within a framework that is distinct from that put in place for the wider English medium sector. And the input of the GTCS will be sought as a valuable part of the process in forming standards and requirements for Gaelic education. There's already a process in place for this, and the bill enables the consultation of the GTCS when it's appropriate to do so. But again, in the spirit of wanting to accept as many amendments as I can, where we can do, I recognise the wish for the GTCS to be specifically listed among the bodies which ministers must consult in relation to education regulations, and I'm happy to support Amendment 82. In terms of 81, not all regulations and standards under the power being amended will relate directly to teachers. So the GTCS has functions which operate as a matter of law, and the Section 6B power proposed in the bill should not be unduly curtailed or framed in that way. And so our feeling about 81 is that it is not necessarily appropriate in that place. On to Amendment 83, we in practice publish consultation results where permission has been given, where this is considered appropriate. We're happy to support this amendment for consultation results relating to the preparation for standards and regulations. 57, the Languages Bill amends the Education Act 2016 by replacing Bars na Gaelic's duty to prepare guidance on Gaelic education with a power on Scottish ministers to produce that guidance. And as this function is being reallocated to ministers rather than an NDPB, it's considered appropriate that this be framed as a power than a duty, but we are happy to support 57. On 58, the Scottish Government amendment removes the power for ministers to give a direction to education authorities in relation to Gaelic education. That follows comments about this power by this committee and the DPLRC at stage 1. And I'm content that the objectives of the power can be effectively achieved by other means. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 81.
Thank you, Convener. And on the basis of the clarification that the Deputy First Minister set out, I'm content to withdraw Amendment 81 and will press, of course, Amendment 82. And I'm pleased that the Government are minded to support that. For completeness, we will also support the other amendments in this group.
Thank you. Pam Duncan-Glancy seeks to withdraw Amendment 81. Does any member object? No member has objected, therefore Amendment 81 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 82 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 81. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 82 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 83 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 81. Ross Greer to move or not move? That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 83 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 12 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 57 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 81. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Move.
That's moved. So the question is that Amendment 57 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 13 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 58 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 81. Deputy First Minister to move formally.
Move formally.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 58 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 15 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 59 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, grouped with Amendments 60, 62 and 64. I call the Deputy First Minister to move Amendment 59 and speak to all amendments in the group. Deputy First Minister.
Moved at the outset. These are very minor corrections which ensure that references to the Education Act 1980 follow the style of the Act into which they are being inserted, ensuring consistency and removing any possible ambiguity.
Anything to say by way of wind up?
No.
No. The question is that Amendment 59 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 60 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 59. Deputy First Minister to move formally.
Moved.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 60 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. And the question is that Section 16 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 61 in the name of Ross Greer, grouped with Amendments 84 and 75. Ross Greer to move Amendment 61 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. Move Amendment 61. These amendments are ultimately about teacher workload, an issue that the committee will be very well familiar with, a recurring theme in almost everything that we do in this committee. Teachers in GME schools face an additional and really quite significant workload burden because they themselves have to do much of the work of translating materials that are produced, by and large, the materials produced by Education Scotland in English into Gaelic so that it's usable in their school setting. Education Scotland does do some work here, but certainly I don't believe in the feedback I've had from GME teachers is that is not routine enough, and we recognise the unsustainable workloads across the teaching profession. I think it's only appropriate that we recognise the particularly acute workload pressures faced by GME teachers, that additional workload pressure. So 61 in relation to Gaelic and 75 in relation to Scots. Simply put, a duty on Education Scotland to consider whether any material that they produce in English should also be produced in Gaelic and Scots. So it doesn't require them to do that in all instances. There will, of course, be instances where that is not necessary, but this just clarifies that that is something that they need to take into consideration, because certainly as far as I'm concerned, Education Scotland has much more capacity to engage in that kind of work than a classroom teacher in a GME school does. So that's the rationale behind those two amendments.
And Pam Duncan-Glancy to speak to Amendment 84 and other amendments in the group. Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. I propose this amendment on the back of various different bits of work that I've been doing, but I was most struck when I visited one of the Gaelic schools in Glasgow, and the teachers there were explaining that some of the materials and the time that it took for them to translate them into Gaelic medium in order for their young people to have access to the materials that they need to do the best they can do in the exams that they have and also throughout their education. And on the basis of that, I proposed amendment number 84 to provide a duty on the examinations boards in Scotland to provide that material for Gaelic medium education so that young people learning through the medium of Gaelic have as much support as people who are learning through the medium of English. And that's why I've proposed this amendment.
Thank you. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much. On these amendments, we are in principle sympathetic with the aims here. There are just some changes that would need to be made to those amendments, and perhaps we could work together in advance of stage 3 to address some of those issues in new drafting. There are some areas of practice and legislative provisions which would make it very difficult for us to support these amendments in their current form, but I do want to see I do want to set out some of the relevant provisions that are either already in place or being developed. The SQA already makes some qualifications available in Gaelic. The Education Bill is proposing to replace the SQA with Qualifications Scotland. Section 7 of that bill will place a duty on Qualifications Scotland to have regard to the needs and the interests of persons using its services, including those who are receiving or wish to receive Gaelic learner or Gaelic medium education. That cross-cutting duty will apply where Qualifications Scotland is exercising all of its functions, including devising and awarding qualifications and accreditation.
Deputy First Minister, take an intervention on that
Pam
point.
Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Convener. I thank the Deputy First Minister for setting that out. This is probably not the time nor the place to go through my concerns around that particular body and indeed that bill. However, what I would say is that this is slightly broader than the duty that is even proposed in the Education Bill. The Education Bill clarifies, to my understanding, that the existing duty that, around the qualifications body to consider making materials available and it just effectively tidies that up for the purposes of the Education Bill. That duty in practice is not enough to stop schools and teachers and staff in schools for having to provide some other material in addition to that. And so this is to strengthen that. So I don't think it's enough that there is a duty within the Education Bill, notwithstanding the fact that that bill has not yet gone through Parliament. But I don't think it's enough to strengthen what's required, given the importance of all of the material being available. So it's not just about the exam papers themselves, but actually some of the material that supports young people to do the best they can in their exams has to be translated by schools, and that takes up a lot of time and in some cases money.
No, I think the member is absolutely right to highlight that. So I think in terms of our comments, they're not necessarily at odds with that. We believe that this requirement probably just needs to be a little bit more targeted. So, for example, there are some subject areas which have the highest impact in terms of fluency, and there should be greater focus on those subjects. There are some concerns that a blanket duty is just quite difficult to fulfil, as not all qualifications are available in Gaelic. So I think it's probably not far removed from where the member wants to get to. And I guess with these amendments, the question is whether it passes at this stage and then we adapt it for stage 3, or we just say, let's work on the drafting before stage 3, and we're very happy to support the member at stage 3.
Would the Deputy First Minister give way?
Yeah.
I mean, I take her point that you could do that either way, but I mean, especially 61 and 75. I mean, they do seem to be fairly gentle. Can she spell out a little bit more? Because all they're saying is consider and must have regard to desirability, which I'm not sure that means anything. What is our real problem with that?
Yeah. So I hadn't, to be fair, come on to Amendments 61 and 75. So that was very much in relation to 84. On 61 and 75, this is just a really simple one. Education Scotland is an agency of the Scottish Government, so it's not possible to use legislation to put duties on it. Any such duty is placed actually on Scottish ministers. So if the members agree not to press, all it is a question of drafting. So in terms of legislative terms, the burden wouldn't be on Education Scotland, it would be on Scottish Government to do that. And I don't think there's really any disagreement. It's more just that from a legal and drafting perspective, some minor concerns have been highlighted. On 61 and 75, John Mason's right. It's fairly straightforward. It's just a question of focusing the duty on Scottish ministers, not Education Scotland. And on the SQA point, it's a question of just the change that's going on in another bill, as well as making sure that it isn't just it's not a blanket approach, that it is quite targeted. Yeah.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you. Just for clarity then, can I clarify that the Deputy First Minister is prepared to look at this for stage 3?
Yeah, absolutely. I would envisage us to be not just in a position to look at it for stage 3, but to support it at stage 3 with some minor drafting changes to 61, 75 and 84.
Thank you. I call on Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 61.
Thanks, Convener. On the basis of the Cabinet Secretary's remarks, I'm happy not to press 61. I would just say, as much as I understand the legal point of Education Scotland's status as an executive agency and therefore responsibility resting with ministers, I think there's a governance point here that this committee has encountered on lots of occasions in relation to Education Scotland and duties on ministers where that duty simply has not cascaded down effectively. So as much as I understand entirely the legal issue around drafting, so I'm happy not to press and for us to work on it ahead of stage 3. I think one of the things that we'll need to take into account there is that, quite frankly, very often duties that are placed on ministers are not being fulfilled by the executive agencies that are accountable to those ministers, and perhaps we'll need to tighten that up in this specific regard. There's a wider governance issue that's not for this committee to consider right now, though. Yes, of course.
The other point is just, I guess, 2 quick points. One is to highlight those organisations that haven't been referenced but who do a lot of work to support Gaelic medium at the moment, in terms of Storlan and Scott Solmarostig, so to highlight the work that they do. And that third point around cascading, I think, is very well made. And so we may want to think about how we incorporate that too as part of our conversations about drafting.
Intervention and for the acknowledgement on that point. So yes, on that basis, I'm happy not to press 61. We'll bring a version of this back for stage 3.
Okay, Ross Greer seeks to withdraw Amendment 61. Does any member object? No member objects, so Amendment 61 is withdrawn. The question is that Section 17 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 62 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 59. Deputy First Minister to move formally.
Moved. That
is moved. So the question is that Amendment 62 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 18 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 19 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 63 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, group with amendments as shown in the groupings. Deputy First Minister to move Amendment 63 and speak to all amendments in the group. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much. So this is quite an extensive section on Gaelic medium education. And in terms of the two amendments that are in my own name, this amendment, Amendment 63, clarifies the timescale within which an authority must establish a catchment area for schools which are providing Gaelic medium education provision at the time that Section 20 comes into force. The timescale will run from the date that Section 20 comes into force, and that is a minor and fairly technical amendment. On Amendment 65, there's no question about the benefits of all Gaelic schools, yet at the same time, the parental experience is that the path towards the establishment of an all-Gaelic school has been far too long and often frustrating. So this amendment seeks to address the situation by putting a clear process in place. The amendment will support parents who want the local authority to formally consider the establishment of an all-Gaelic school in their area. Briefly, if requested, the Education Authority must complete an assessment of whether it would be viable for the authority to establish an all-Gaelic school in an area specified in the request. In completing this assessment, the authority must have regard to a number of considerations set out in the new provisions. Where the result of the assessment is that it would be viable, the authority must take steps to establish an all-Gaelic school. All Gaelic schools are an ideal environment for providing immersion education, which is central to the success of Gaelic medium education. Without doubt, all Gaelic schools provide important benefits for Gaelic and actually go to the heart of what has been frequently identified in the committee debate around the level of fluency. On Amendments 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93 and 94, the aim of those amendments are to, as I understand it, simplify the process for parents wishing Gaelic medium education for their children and to combine the two stages of an initial assessment and a full assessment on one process. I completely understand the sentiment behind those amendments and the desire to make things more straightforward, but they do leave some gaps and some unanswered questions which could unintentionally make the process longer and more complicated. So the amendments require that an education authority must provide GME if there is demand from 5 or more children in a year group, unless it is unreasonable to do so, having regard to the matters set out in the amendment. However, it's not clear what decision could be made by the authority if there are fewer than 5 children, or whether they even have to undertake an assessment in that case. It's also not clear whether a full assessment is the only possible route for the authority to take, even if they are content to provide GME. There are some questions outstanding about how this process would operate and some issues that need to be addressed. In view of this, I would very much like to give the matter some further consideration in consultation with the member to ensure that the drafting works in a technical sense and improves the position for parents, young people and all those involved in the delivery of GME. I think if we could come back to stage 3, which has become a refrain in all of these groups, then I think we would have quite a good package of support for parents who are keen to bring forward Gaelic medium education in their area, and very keen to work with the member to that effect. I move Amendment 63.
I call Miles Briggs to speak to Amendment 85 and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. And can I start by welcoming the Cabinet Secretary's amendments 63 and 65. My proposed amendments 85 to 94 simplifies and strengthens the current mechanisms for assessing demand for Gaelic medium education by compressing the current system of an initial assessment and subsequent full assessment into what I think would be a useful single process. This would make the process quicker and less stressful for parents making key decisions about their children's future education. Specifically, the current sections 9, 10, 11 of the Education Scotland Act 2016, as prospectively amended, are compressed into a single section 9, and the crucial provision which requires education authorities to provide Gaelic medium education when the threshold of 5 children is reached, unless it would be unreasonable to do so, is moved forward to emphasise its importance. After 40 years of Gaelic medium education, there are only 8 all-Gaelic schools in Scotland, with 4 of these being situated in Glasgow. There's currently no strategy or process in place for the establishment of schools, and it's left to parents often to lobby their local authorities. This has been, on occasions, meant local parent groups having to fund feasibility studies for schools. all schools have taken many years, as we know, from initial requests from parents through to their opening. A minimum of 10 years this has taken, which means that many parents who are campaigning today for schools often don't see the benefit for their children. And campaigners have told me that currently there are 5 areas where parents are campaigning, so far unsuccessfully, for Gaelic medium education in schools. So my proposed amendments, I think, can help simplify that process. I've listened to what the Cabinet Secretary's had to say in regards to drafting, and happy to work with her at stage 3. So I won't be moving amendments 85 to 94.
Okay, thank you. I call Ross Clear.
Thanks, Convener. I've just got a couple of questions about amendments 63 and 65, and I thought they'd be best placed as a contribution rather than interrupting the flow of the Deputy First Minister's speech. So, in the first instance, I wonder if she could address whether these amendments are compliant with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, because much as I very much welcome them overall, in the new 13A, there's the ability for parents to make the request, but not for young people themselves. But in 13B, the young people themselves, pupils, can input once the process is triggered. So there seems a little bit of an inconsistency to me. If we're allowing young people to have a role in 13B as part of the process, should we not, particularly given UNCRC now being part of our own domestic law, give them an equivalent ability to request it under 13A? Following on from Miles Briggs' point around how the experience from many parents is they have to campaign for this, and by the time they've achieved it, their children are no longer in school. It specifies currently parents of pupils who are in school. So I'm wondering why we couldn't perhaps change that to include the parents of preschool children who would be more likely to have achieved it in time for their own children to benefit. My third question, I suppose, starts off with plea for assistance from the Deputy First Minister to help me pronounce the name of Common Parent, the Gaelic Parents Association. The Law Society had some questions about this. I'm wondering, are they established in statute? Because if they are, I think it's fine to specifically reference them in here. If they're not, is it advisable to include a specific organisation in law who themselves are not established in law and who could change form, name, status, etc. at some point without an Act of Parliament, but that would then require this Act of Parliament to be changed?
Point number 1, we will come back to you with greater consideration of what you perceive to be the difference between the two sections in terms of a child's or pupil's ability to make the request. Obviously, we are dealing in some cases with early learning as well, so we'll need to consider that. On your last question, in Common Parent are not in statute. I guess over the period of 40 years that Miles Briggs identified, they have evolved to become the primary national body on for parents of GME pupils. And so they are the obvious group for that. On the second question, I actually have forgotten what it was, so feel free to intervene.
If parents of preschool children could be included, given that, as Miles Briggs pointed out, parents of children who are already in school often have to campaign for so long that their children have left school by the time they've achieved what they're looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll give that some consideration.
Thank you.
I will wind up just to say that everything that Miles Briggs said was true. So he is absolutely right in terms of how difficult it is, and I am frequently receiving correspondence from parents that are, to use a technical term, pulling their hair out in terms of trying to engage with the process. So he is absolutely right in terms of the need to simplify the process. And so if we can just ensure that the amendments answer some of the unanswered questions that I identified in my opening remarks, then I think we have a very compelling package here, combining his amendments with the ones I have introduced. Thank you.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 63 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. I call Amendment 64 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 59. Deputy First Minister to move formally. That's moved. So the question is that Amendment 64 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 20 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that sections 21 and 22 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 84 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 61. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Not move.
That's not moved. I call Amendment 65 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 63. Deputy First Minister, to move formally.
Moved.
That is moved. The question, therefore, is that Amendment 65 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 85 in the name of Miles Briggs, already debated with Amendment 63. Miles Briggs, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That's not moved. Therefore, I call Amendments 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93 and 94, all in the name of Miles Briggs and all previously debated with Amendment 63. I invite Miles Briggs to move Amendments 86 to 94 en bloc.
Thank you, Convener. Not moved en bloc.
They are not moved en bloc. Therefore, Miles Briggs has indicated that he will not be moving Amendments 86 to 94. It would be helpful if any member who wishes to move any of the Amendments 86 to 94 to indicate now. No member has indicated that they wish to do so. I therefore confirm for the record that the following amendments in the name of Miles Briggs are not moved. Amendments 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93 and 94. I call the question is that section 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that sections 23 and 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. I call amendment...
Sorry, Convener, was it 24 and 25?
Sorry, if I said that wrongly, I'll say it again. Thank you, Mr Mason. The question is that sections 24 and 25 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yeah. We are agreed. I call Amendment 66 in the name of Ross Greer, group with Amendment 95. Ross Greer to move Amendment 66 and speak to both amendments in the group. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Convener. So Amendment 66 would place a duty on ministers to conduct a review of the status of Salma Rustig, and that in particular that review should consider whether it should be designated as a higher education institution and have degree issuing power. Ministers would be required to publish a report on the review, to lay that before Parliament, and probably the most important element of this is the review is required to take place within a year from this section of the bill coming into force. Again, acknowledging the wider discussions we've been having around the urgency of the situation. I think there's a consensus across Parliament of the importance of Salma Rustig as an institution operating through the Medium of Gaelic. It's the National Centre for Gaelic Language, Education and Culture, and it plays a significant role nationally and, of course, internationally for Gaelic. So I think it's right and proper that as part of the bill we should be reviewing its status. It's certainly my position and the position of my party that Salma Rustig should have degree issuing power. I don't want to put it bluntly, bounce them into that before they are ready. I think a review process would allow us to consider all the issues and potential barriers to them having that power and that status, to make sure they have time to put together an adequate business case, that they receive the support that they require, but that should be the aspiration. So that is the motivation behind Amendment 66, and I recognise that Willie Rennie is very much coming at this from a similar position, but I'll let him speak to his own amendment.
Thank you. And I call Willie Rennie to speak to Amendment 95 and the other amendment in the group. Mr Rennie.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, my amendment goes a little bit further than Ross Greer, that it stipulates action that needs to be taken by the government rather than simply a review. We believe that this has been debated for a considerable period of time and it's now time to make a decision on it. The institution tell me that they are ready for this. Other institutions have been granted this status already, including the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. So that's why we want to go further and recommend action rather than simply a review.
Thank you. Just before I call the Deputy First Minister, as a committee member, I've also met with Gillian Munro, the Principal, and I thought she made a very compelling case for this. It was certainly a very useful meeting for me, and I wanted to get that on the record. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much, Convener, and I am heartened by your comments, because I think that if you take what Ross Greer has shared, what Willie Rennie has shared, what you have shared, what I imagine other committee members may go on to share, there is actually a cross-party consensus on the need to move here. And the only difference in the amendments is the extent to which it happens now or it happens after some preparatory work. But I want to emphasise that from a government perspective, we would expect any preparatory work to happen at pace. I know that one of the comments that Solomon Ostig have made to me is the need for other bodies in the public sector in particular to engage well with them to reach this end point. And Ross Greer's amendment is time-stamped in terms of requiring that to happen within a year. It puts a responsibility on the review to be laid before Parliament, therefore inviting parliamentary scrutiny. And it requires a report to be written which considers all the various points. I am very sympathetic to Willie Rennie's amendment. There's just a few minor issues which would need to be considered before that would progress, in that we would want to define what changes result from in law, changes define in law the changes that would happen as a result of being designated as a small specialist institution, because it doesn't actually have a definition in law right now. And it should also be noted that it's not wholly within the gift of ministers to determine whether an institution has degree awarding powers. That is for the Privy Council. There are some outstanding issues that do need to be resolved that don't entirely sit on Solomon Ostig's shoulders. In fact, they will require other parts of the public sector to engage well with them, for example, questions around funding. But in terms of Solomon Ostig is a very important part of the Gaelic community and a very important part of our higher and further education community. It is the National Centre for Gaelic Language Education and Culture, and in fact we cannot meet any of the aims and objectives within this bill or within our policy and our strategy without Sol Mor-Ostig. So it must play an important role for many, many years to come. Both amendments indicate the need to move. Our position is that we will support Ross Greer's amendment with a view to conducting that review, because we do want that review to be done well and for Solomon Ostig to be well supported at the point that they become either a small specialist institution or another status. But that needs to be done, and it needs to be done well, which requires just a little bit of time to review. But neither will we vote against Willie Rennie's amendment in recognition of the important points that he highlights. But we do think it's important that the preparatory work is done and the other parts of the public sector engage well with that review, and that Parliament also has an opportunity to respond to the report that is laid in a time-stamped manner. So I want to be very clear in my comments about the value we place on Solomon Ostig, and that we see those amendments as just two different routes to get to our end goal, but it does require some preparatory work to be done first for Solomon Ostig to have the best chances of success.
Thank you. I call Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 66.
Thanks, Convener. Just to echo the Cabinet Secretary's remarks, I think it is important, and that's why it's in my amendment, that there's a role for Parliament here, that the review results in a report that's laid before Parliament, because I think there is a very strong cross-party consensus here on the importance of Solomon Ostig and on getting towards that point of having degree issuing power. Therefore, I think it's important that we preserve that role for Parliament to make sure that we can keep this process going to that shared outcome. Willie Rennie and I's amendments, as has been mentioned, have a lot of crossover. I'm therefore certainly happy to support his. I recognise that There may be a requirement to do a little bit of reconciliation at stage 3 on this, but on that basis, I would certainly encourage committee members to support both amendments, given that there is a clear shared desired outcome here, and we can resolve the areas of overlap with some tidying up at stage 3.
So you're pressing Amendment 66?
Yes, sorry, I will press Amendment 66.
Fine. The question is that Amendment 66 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 95 in the name of Willie Rennie, already debated with Amendment 66. Willie Rennie, to move or not move?
Moved.
The amendment is moved. So the question is that Amendment 95 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a division. Okay, so on Amendment 95, could those in favour please indicate? And those against Amendment 95? And those abstaining on Amendment 95? Thank you. Okay, so the result of the vote on Amendment 95 is 4, 6, against 0. There were 4 abstentions. Therefore, Amendment 95 is agreed to. I call Amendment 67 in the name of Michael Mara, already debated with Amendment 47. Michael Mara, to move or not move?
I'm sorry, was that 67?
It is, yes. Amendment 67, already debated with Amendment 47.
Not moved.
Not moved. I call Amendment 68 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 33. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 68 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 96 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 76. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. The question is that Section 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 69 in the name of Emma Harper, grouped with Amendments 71 and 74. Emma Harper, to move Amendment 69 and speak to all amendments in the group. Ms Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the opportunity to move these important amendments. I'd like to start by thanking the many Scots organisations and individuals who have been so helpful to me and who support our Scots Language Cross-Party Group, which I co-convene. These organisations include the Scots Language Centre, Urvice, Scots Language Society, Open University in Scotland, and there are also many individuals associated with these organisations, and I must include Bruce Eunson, Dr Sylvia Vernicki and Dr Michael Dempster. They have all made invaluable contributions to promoting Scots, both at the CPG and in providing input for me with this bill. There were some discussions at stage 1 about whether the term Scots includes the different dialects of the Scots language used in different parts of Scotland. So I would be keen to look at introducing these amendments. So some of the aspects are that we have examples of dialects like North East dialect is also called the Doric, for instance. So my amendments in this group seek to reassure the Scots language community on this point, not by changing the definition of Scots in an exhaustive way that could be inadvertently exclude something, but by focusing on the substantive sections of Part 2 of the bill. Amendment 69 makes clear that the Scottish Minister's objectives for the promotion of Scots in the Scots language strategy are to include the different dialects of Scots used in different parts of Scotland. Amendment 71 clarifies that the Scottish Minister's power to give guidance to public authorities on the promotion of Scots likewise includes the different dialects of Scots. Section 31 of the Bill places an education authority under a duty to promote, facilitate and support Scots language education. And Amendment 74 makes clear that the Education Authority may discharge its functions relating to Scots language education through teaching and learning in the dialect of the Scots language most relevant to its area. So, for instance, in the north east of Scotland, Doric would be the most relevant. I hope that provides some reassurance for all the stakeholders. So I'm asking committee to support my amendments in this group, and I move Amendment 69.
Thank you. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you very much, Convener. There was some discussion at stage 1 about whether the term Scots includes the different dialects of the Scots language used in different parts of Scotland. And as Emma Harper has said, these amendments are trying to ensure that there is reassurance across all those who speak the language. And so amendments in this group are welcome. I do think they offer reassurance. They do make clear that the bill's provision on Scots includes the different dialects, and we are content to support the amendments.
Thank you. Emma Harper to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 69.
Thanks, Convener. Nothing really more to add, just recognising that Scots is spoken in a variety of ways and different dialects in different parts of Scotland, and I urge colleagues to support amendments. Yeah, sure.
Pam Duncan-Glancy.
I thank the member for taking an intervention. Can I ask what discussion she's had with the Association of Directors of Education and teachers about Amendment 74 in particular?
I've had the discussions based on the engagement with the Scots language community when we discussed all the amendments that we were proposing, or amendments to take forward. So, so no direct discussion, but it's been within the Scots language community who I've been engaging with, who I believe are experts in Scots. So I just would encourage members to support Amendments 69, 71 and 74. Thank you.
So you are pressing Amendment 69?
Pressing Amendment 69.
Therefore, the question is that Amendment 69 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 70 in the name of Ross Greer, group with Amendment 97. Ross Greer to move Amendment 70 and speak to both amendments in the group.
Thanks, Convener. And as these are my last amendments, I just want to start by putting on record my thanks to the Bill team for all the work they've put in particular their response to the very, very long list of proposals that I've put to them over recent weeks. So 70 and 97 are treading familiar ground for me here. This is about a requirement to publicise how the public can input into the draft strategy for the Scots language, and similar to previous amendments, it is about publication of the results of that consultation.
Thank you. Deputy First Minister.
Thank you, Convener. Thanks to Ross Greer for his collaborative approach as well, and the fact that there were so many amendments throughout the course of the bill, and I think that speaks to his ability to engage on a cross-party basis and with external stakeholders. We always publicise arrangements for engaging in consultations on draft strategies and other documents, and we have a practice of publishing consultation results where appropriate. Since Amendments 70 and 97 reflect that existing practice, we're very happy to support them.
Thank you. Ross Greer to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 70.
Nothing further to add, Convener. I will press Amendment 70.
The question is that Amendment 70 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 97 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 70. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Move.
That is moved. So the question is that Amendment 97 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 27 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are. The question is that Sections 28 and 29 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 71 in the name of Emma Harper, already debated with Amendment 69. Emma Harper to move or not move?
Moved.
That's moved. So the question is that Amendment 71 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Section 30 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 72 in the name of the Deputy First Minister in a group of its own. Deputy First Minister to move and speak to Amendment 72.
Thank you, Convener. Amendment 72 makes the same provision for Scots as made for Gaelic by Amendment 55, which I believe the committee has already agreed, hopefully, if my memory serves me right. As with Gaelic, it's important that ministers have the necessary powers in support of their functions for Scots, including the ability to undertake research, inquiries, to collect and to publish statistics on Scots. That will assist with the implementation of the Scots language strategy and ensure that there can be effective information gathering for its further development. If I could, Convener, also take the liberty of just thanking everybody for their engagement. Recognise that, because this is the last time I will be speaking, recognise that we have set ourselves a lot of work for stage 3, but I think the debate has clarified the priorities, and I have said in every single evidence session that I want this bill to be the product of Parliament, not a government-imposed bill, and I think the more amendments that we can accept and the more amendments that we can work with you on, the better, so that it is a bill that does reflect Parliament's priorities, and I look forward to the engagement on that. I move Amendment 72.
Anything else to say by way of wind-up?
No.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 72 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 73 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, already debated with Amendment 56. Deputy First Minister to move formally.
Moved.
That's moved. So the question is that Amendment 73 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 74 in the name of Emma Harper, already debated with Amendment 69. Emma Harper to move or not move?
Moved, please.
That's moved. So the question is that Amendment 74 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Sorry, we're not. We are not agreed. There will be a division on Amendment 74. OK, so could I ask on Amendment 74 for those in favour to indicate their support? And those against Amendment 74? And those wishing to abstain on Amendment 74? Thank you. The result of the vote on Amendment 74 is yes, for Amendment 74, 9, against 0. There was 1 abstention. Amendment 74 is therefore agreed to. The question is that Section 31 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that Sections 31 to, the question is that Sections 32 to 35 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 75 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 61. Ross Greer to move or not move?
An anticlimactic end, I'm afraid. Not moved, Convener.
That is not moved. The question is that Sections 36 to 38 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The question is that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. That ends Stage 2 consideration of the bill. Can I thank the Deputy First Minister and her supporting officials for their attendance at this meeting today. We were potentially going to go into Day 2 next Wednesday, so you now have time in your diary. I'm sure your officials will fill that very quickly. But can I thank all committee members, the Deputy First Minister, our clerking team as well, for their efforts today. And I close this meeting. Thank you.